Hi, welcome back guys, this is your friend, WTFW with another fiction. What if Deku Tokoyami and Baku Fate in the League of Villain? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Taking place during the school trip arc, we center on Tokoyami in the aftermath of his quirk Dark Shadows rampage. Villains continue to fill the forest, their mission to capture Bakugo made clear. But their sights have also been set on Tokoyami, and the unfortunate connection these two students have had since their battle against each other in the sports festival will decide what happens after they are both captured. Tokoyami tried to settle the conflicting emotions still ravaging his body, weary from being possessed by Dark Shadow. He thought he'd be able to control it this time, but he should have known that the events unfolding before him would be too much to bear. His heart thumped wildly in his chest, and he could still hear the wails of his quirk demanding to roam free once more. If possible, he'd like to refrain from using it again this night. But with villains running around the woods, that might be too much to ask for. If not for Todoroki and Bakugo keeping him at bay with the light of their own quirks, he shuddered to think where he'd still be, rampaging through the terrain, attacking indiscriminately. Tokoyami tried to tune into the conversation going on around him. Apparently, he'd missed a lot during his brief time of irrationality. Was it brief? He couldn't remember anymore. But he could call to memory a voice, urging him on. Tokoyami, don't fight against it. Give yourself over to Dark Shadow. He hung his head. Shoji Midoriya, I'm sorry. My spirit was not prepared. He didn't know how he could apologize enough for being so weak during such a crucial time. It was lucky that the only one to receive any significant damage was the villain. Otherwise, he wasn't sure he'd be able to deal with the guilt. Save it, Shoji mumbled from behind the mask covering his mouth. If I were you, I wouldn't be worrying about that now. That's right, Midoriya added. Tokoyami wrenched his eyes up to where his classmate was lying on Shoji's back, horribly damaged from something he had no part in. The sight of his broken limbs and deeply bruised skin made it hard to look at him. We know now that Kaken is one of the villain's targets. Bakugo. Why would they be after his life? His mind blurred as he staggered to his feet, tendrils of his quirk's possession still clouding his thoughts. But physically he was fine, so he had no right to complain. He listened for the most part as they discussed how to keep Bakugo safe, with the explosive boy growing ever more impatient with their nonsense. Tokoyami snapped back to attention fully when he heard his name. What's more, if Tokoyami's all right, then we still have a method of controlling the unrivaled power of Dark Shadow. Wait, hold on now. You can't just assume that without knowing. With this lineup, not even All Might would be a match against Up. Bakugo ended up interrupting their spiel, not on his behalf, but still in a way he appreciated. What the hell is with this plan, you pricks? He roared in his typical adamant fashion. Todoroki turned to him in that cool, demanding way that was so customary of him. We just need you to walk in the middle. Now come on. They went along the path through the forest at a relatively swift pace, with no idea of what would lie ahead of them. Tokoyami took up the rear of their unit, falling in behind Bakugo. This newest encounter with him made Tokoyami begin to wonder if it was a good thing to be alongside him. After his defeat during the sports festival at those flashy explosions, he'd worked hard to rely less on his quirk and build up other parts of himself. Having his weakness be so easily exploited now had been something of a relief, or as Bakugo had said, unfortunate chemistry. Even now he marched just a few paces ahead of him, ready and willing to set off his explosions at a moment's notice. It was truly amazing how much control he had over his quirk. It was no wonder the villains were after him, especially if they had been watching the tournament. Such a ruthless and powerful student had come out on top, screaming obscenities all the while. Tokoyami didn't regret losing to him back then, but he does find himself wondering if he could have attained first place if not for their poor compatibility. No, I got only as much attention as I deserved for my efforts. anymore and I would find myself on the villain's kill list like Midoriya. Or worse yet in Bakugu's situation. I can only hope that Dark Shadow's outburst didn't cause too much unwanted interest. Voices could be heard from ahead. The maniacal laughing of a girl, and the more familiar cries of some of the class of one girls. Was Tsuyu all right? This was enough to encourage Todoroki and the rest to burst into a full-on sprint, heading towards the commotion. Before he and Bakugo could have a chance to follow, a cold feeling swept over him, stopping him dead in his tracks. He couldn't bring himself to turn his head, and his usually hot-tempered classmate was also unusually subdued, freezing him to one spot. A hand brushed past the feathers on his head to rest on his shoulder, and a villain wearing a white mask leaned into his line of sight. 2 for 1 isn't so bad a deal. After what you did to Moonfish, well, we have to compensate our numbers somehow. You and young Bakugo don't mind too terribly, right? A black veil covered his eyes, not unlike the feeling of when Dark Shadow had taken control from him. That's what this was. Control being taken away from him yet again. The world around him fell away, and he lost sense of what was happening. He was dimly aware of Bakugo, in the same situation, still visible to him. His mouth was open in what could only be a long howl of pure rage. Tokoyami kept his beak shut, recognizing the futility of crying out to those who can't hear you. Mr. Compress looked down at his new prize. 2 lovely little spheres containing incredible power for such young and impressionable students. Their mission was complete. Shigaraki would be more than happy with these results, especially with the added bonus of the dark feathered monster. In another part of the woods, Dabai and Twice waited expectantly for the arrival of the other villains at the rendezvous place. Toga joined them shortly thereafter, smiling gleefully. Most important of all, though, was the arrival of Mr. Compress, having announced the success of the mission. Twice and Toga were chatting with insipid excitement. Both of you, shut up, Dabai sneered. He listened in on his surroundings, and his attention was once again brought back to a bush that he thought had rustled earlier. The idea that someone thought they could hide from them was annoying. Before he could think to reveal the hidden brat, a raucous came from above, and a team of notorious class A1 students burst through the trees in heavy pursuit of Mr. Compress. These brats, I know them. Who are they? Dabai ignored Twice. Mr. Dodge. And he fired off a blast of flames against the kids that had so foolishly come to stop them. As chaos ensued in a final fight against the villains, Aoyama couldn't bring himself to leave his sheltered position in the nearby bushes and join the fray. His classmates were holding their own, but right now he couldn't find the courage to sparkle like he so often claimed. But it wasn't just his safety at stake. If he made the wrong move, he'd also be exposing Kyoka and Toru, who were lying unconscious on the ground beside him. He couldn't believe Momo had been so willing to leave them in his care. What was he supposed to do? It had been nothing but a miracle that they hadn't already been discovered. Aoyama peeked through the bushes at the battle unfolding before him. The villains, their mission had been completed. That could only mean that. But Shaoji held up a hand in triumph, holding 2 small capsules and declaring that he has Bakugo and Tokoyami. Aoyama breathed a sigh of relief. There was no reason for him to intervene if they were able to handle the situation. And yet it seemed that just as quickly his hopes were dashed by the villain's revelation. Mr. Compress laughed, reaching up to remove his mask as he made a grand reveal worthy of a stage magician. You see, one of the fundamentals of magic is that you flaunt things, only when you have other things to hide. Aoyama felt his heart sink as he watched the villains begin to escape through an all too familiar swirling dark mist, the same that had transported him and everyone else when they were trapped in the Uzji. Nothing had changed. The villains had wreaked horrid damage on everyone and were now walking away with 2 of his classmates within their grasp. There was no way he could sit by and just watch. He had the ability to act now and take them by surprise. If he could just do that, then he might have actually been of use in this whole fiasco. With his quirk, He could make a difference and shine brighter than anyone else at the very end. Well then, until the next time, Mr. Compress smirked. The sinister tone of the villains struck Aoyama to his core. Just when he had positioned himself to shoot of his naval laser to intercept the villains, he found himself frozen and unwilling. The crushing reality of his cowardice produced a sob that rattled his body. "Non, I can't do it. I can't be a hero right now." Dabai coolly looked down at the defeated heroes. "Confirmed. Release it." "Awa, they really didn't put up much of a fight. My show went right as planned." With a snap of his fingers, Mr. Compress released the captured states of Tokoyami and Bakugo, as they were already disappearing into the portal. Hands seen visibly wrapped around the students' necks reaffirmed their status as prisoners of the League of Villains. Bakugo, Tokoyami, Kaken. Midoriya made one last desperate leap towards the two of them. But it was clear to everyone else already that it was futile. Bakugo looked down with a pained look of what might have been fear. But the words he said rang clear. "Stay back, Deku." Tokoyami stretched his hand out ever so slightly in one last desperate attempt to reach his friends, as the darkness enveloped him. "I'm sorry." And just like that, both of them were gone, stranded in a hostile situation with an uncertain future. All of them, every student standing out in a forest filled with fire, ice, gas, and blood, had lost that night. The failure of their rescue stinging like a fresh wound. The students could only stand by in utter disbelief as Midoriya cried out to the sky at the loss of their friends. Tokoyami watched in horror as the sight of his friends began to vanish. Whatever it was that had entrapped him had been released, and he was now vividly aware of the villain's familiar mist pulling them into the unknown. A hand that radiated heat held on to him firmly, and when he glanced down as much as he could muster, he saw horribly scarred purple skin held together by crude stitches. He was at a loss, his inability to do anything a burden. He could only watch as Midoriya reached towards them a final time, with what little power he had left, calling out to the student beside him that had been met with the same unfortunate fate. Had this all been his fault? Somehow, it must have been. If only he had paid more attention, or seen the villain coming, or something. Tokoyami reached his hand out ever so slightly, even as the pull of the portal sought to suck him into another void of darkness. "I'm sorry." And then there was nothing for him to reach out to. The mist of the villain, Kurogiri, was suffocating. He closed his eyes tight against it, but it only lasted a moment before he was dumped unceremoniously onto a cold, hard wood floor. He was only able to see the room and the menacing faces looking down on him briefly before chaos ensued. Bakugo rose from the floor, shaking from fear and rage. "I'll take you all down for what you did to me," he roared, instinctively blasting everything around him. In a panic, Tokoyami unleashed Dark Shadow to protect himself from the blasts. But it hissed and recoiled from the light. A swift kick was delivered to Bakugo's back, knocking him into Tokoyami. He winced as another explosion went off near his face, and Dark Shadow receded unapologetically into his body with a hiss of contempt. "Stop, stop," Tokoyami had to yell, and Bakugo regarded him for the first time, shocked as though he hadn't realized that the bird-headed student had become a part of the League of Villains capture ploy. Then his eyes narrowed, and the look of determination could be clearly read. "We're going to take these bastards down and escape from here." A raspy, demanding voice caught their attention. "The hell is this? Why aren't you doing anything to restrain them? And where are the others?" Tamura Shigaraki faced them from where he sat perched on a bar stool. The grisly hand concealing his face masked his emotions, but the irritation and anger dripping from his voice were evident. Tokoyami was effectively pinned to the ground, the same ghoulish hand that had gripped him before now shoving his beak into the floor. He willed his quirk to defend him from the assault, but it came reluctantly, he could feel, and when it did, the villain holding him down unleashed fire from his other hand. His quirk left him once more. It didn't make sense, though. It should still be night out. So why was Dark Shadow holding up so poorly? Even with the fire, it shouldn't be like this. It occurred to him that his quirk might intentionally be unresponsive to him at the moment out of spite. It always became this way after he lost control, but it had been so long since the first time that he'd hoped it would be better by now. Right now he was feeling worse than quirkless. Now's not the time for this. The villain held his fire close to Tokoyami's face, and with no way to avoid it, the flames started to singe his feathers. Well, aren't you a welcome surprise? Light's your weakness, huh? Splody over there made it pretty clear. It should be pretty easy to take care of you, then. Shigaraki came to stand by them. Dabai, what is this? We were only supposed to get Bakugo. Anything else might be too troubling for me to want to deal with. The way he said that hung like a threat in the air. Tokoyami was reminded of the damage he had done to Aizawa-sensei back when they infiltrated the USG, and more recently of the encounter between him and Midoriya at the mall. Dabai sighed, loosening his grip on his beak so he could breathe better. I don't know. You'd have to ask Compress about that. Oh, the white-masked magician stepped up nervously. You should have seen him. You may remember that student from the tournament, but what I saw tonight went above and beyond that. That quirk is a literal monster, even more so than that moonfish. Took him out with a single hit, even. This one has tricks up his sleeve. All right, I get it, Shigaraki said, waving him aside to stride over to where Bakugo had been suppressed by a mound of twice clones without too much struggle. So Moonfish isn't with us anymore. Muscular and mustard, too. Fine, whatever. If they couldn't make it back, then that's their own damn fault. The success of our mission will compensate our loss. And Dabai, since you seem to have a pretty good grasp of the situation, I'm leaving you in control of that bird. Lock him up in the back room. First and foremost, I wish to discuss with young Bakugo before addressing this wonderfully unexpected guest. Dabai lifted Tokoyami up by the hood of his burned and shredded coat, bringing him to his feet and pushing him forcefully towards a door behind the bar. Tokoyami chanced to look behind him to get a sense of Bakugo's condition. He didn't look hurt, but he was unusually quiet while being apprehended by the villains. It'll make things harder to be separated. His best bet would just be listening for information, but being separated so soon from the only somewhat friendly face didn't set well with him. The door opened to a stockroom filled with old bottles and crates, lit by a lone light bulb. The air was stale and tinged with the smell of beer and gunpowder. In the back of the room sat a rusted cage, just slightly larger than a dog crate. We didn't exactly prepare for 2 prisoners. Hope you don't mind the minor inconvenience, but gotta restrain you somehow. This can be a pretty decent bird cage, right? They walked right up and stood before it. Dabai let go of Tokoyami and waited. He looked down at the cage dejectedly, unwilling to enter so easily, but knowing he had no choice. It would do him no good to start something at this point. Tokoyami crouched to enter and sat on the cold steel floor, turning to look back at his captor. The villain smirked. I can already tell you're going to be easier than that other punk. Give me the easy job, and you'll do just fine here. All you have to do is sit tight and don't cause any trouble, right? Tokoyami watched him coldly as he clicked the lock into place. He wanted to hurl a cutting response at him, but kept his beak shut in case he said something that angered the fire quirk user. His cool smugness and superior position reminded him of everything he once disliked about Todoroki. Of course, the only thing he shares with the current Todoroki is their fire abilities and almost emotionless blue eyes. Help yourself to whatever booze you can reach. Just don't go reaching too far, and don't tell anyone I said that. You're a minor, after all, he laughed, walking away from the cage. Dabai turned back to him as he reached the door. Did you want the lights on or off? On, please. Okay, then. He turned off the switch and closed the door behind him, plunging the room and the scared, fretful student into darkness broken only by a thin sliver of light creeping out from the other room. Tokoyami let out a shuddered breath. He tried to pick up on the conversation in the other room going on without him. But a pestering voice that had been invited by the lack of light made it difficult to direct his attention. Tokoyami sat there in the dark for an indistinguishable amount of time. He kept his eyes focused on the little bit of light seeping out from under the door. But it didn't help much to keep out the intrusive thoughts that circled his mind. Dark shadow had been ceaselessly pestering him within the inner sanctum of his shaken mind since being left alone. While usually he could get his quirk to leave him be, this time the shadow that lurked inside refused to listen to him. It whispered to him constantly, pleading to let it free again. His skin was chill with tension as dark shadow sought to escape the boundary of his body. If the cage that held Tokoyami right now, bleak and easily breakable, but inescapable for fear of getting a reaction from the villains, was what was holding the student back, then Tokoyami's body was a cage of equal significance to the restrained power of dark shadow. But didn't you like having so much power? His quirk urged. No, I didn't. It was hurting people. I was defeating your enemies. What kind of hero would be against easily getting rid of those that oppose them? Not like that. That wasn't me. It's too dangerous. I don't want to win like that. There's always a better way. How selfish, Dark Shadow hissed, more upset now at his master's denial of his own amazing quirk. It seethed with anger, he could tell, but Tokoyami hoped that it would leave it at that. But of course it wouldn't. No, why would it ever leave him alone? So are you saying you'd let the people who hurt you run amok, just because you don't want to use your full potential? Do you mean that you'd let innocent people die because you thought that there was another way? So that you didn't have to dirty your own hands? I know you already feel guilty. Shut up. I guess you aren't actually a hero. Shut up. Tokoyami hadn't realized when he had suddenly yelled out loud. Dark Shadow laughed at his discomfort, and the torment that ate away at him had caused him to break out in a cold sweat. Then the door opened, and the light from the bar flooded in. Dabai poked his head in, annoyed, and he flicked a light back on. It hasn't been that long since I left you, has it? He caught sight of Tokoyami, shivering and distressed, and entered the room. Tokoyami shifted to try and see what was going on behind him in the other room, but before he could, the door was closed. Whoa, hey, you're not doing too hot. I know this isn't the most favorable situation to be in, but lighten up a little. He crossed the room, Tokoyami glaring at him with slanted red eyes all the while. He tried to put up a brave front, but it must have been fairly evident that he was still badly shaken by something the villain couldn't comprehend. The emaciated flesh of Dabai's face crinkled as he grimaced and might have been construed as concern. You don't have some sort of medical condition, do you? That bakugo is such a lively individual. But you look like you want to drop dead. Tokoyami shrugged deeper into the folds of his hoodie, taking very little comfort from it. Strange of you to express worry after leaving me in such deplorable conditions. All I asked was that you leave the lights on, Tokoyami rasped. Dabai looked down at him with suspicion. Is that what has you so worked up? It's not like I meant any harm from it. Don't make me out to be the villain here. Tokoyami could swear that the strange youth was speaking with sarcasm, but decided it wasn't worth pressing further. The last thing he needed was to anger any one of these unpredictable evildoers. But now that he had the attention of this one, perhaps he could learn some things. What's going on in the other room? Dabai sat himself on one of the heavy wooden storage boxes. Why, you worried about your friend? Not particularly, knowing him. Sounds about right. Yeah, that kid's a monster. Now I understand why the boss wanted him so badly. But we got him under control without too much damage. You should be happy to hear. He reached down to grab a bottle and began to drink. None of you have made my job any easier. Then again, it's been a hell of a busy night. Darkness tends to drain the energy of all living things, Tokoyami agreed solemnly. He trained his gaze towards the floor of the cage. He didn't think the villain alliance would intentionally try to hurt either him or Bakugo. Clearly, they saw potential in the two of them, so they're of value. But Tokoyami wasn't supposed to be a part of their plan, so his role in all this could only be questioned. These thoughts on the future thoroughly disheartened him, and his body ached from the events of the night. He wanted to sleep, but knew that if he tried he would find it impossible. He was hardly comfortable enough to breathe as it was, the weight of his circumstances pushing down on his shoulders. All the while, he could tell that he was being diligently watched. The two of them sat in silence for a while before Dabai broke it with a sigh. "If you want to get out of that dingy cage, you can go ahead. It's garbage at this point to keep you in there, and I know it won't stop something like you." Tokoyami scowled. "No, I'm fine, thank you." Dark Shadow took Dabai's words as an invitation and sliced through the flimsy metal bars of the cage, obliterating it in an instant before receding back into him. "I never said you could do that." The villain blinked in surprise, but didn't make a move. It was his fault anyway. Tokoyami growled as he pushed aside the remains of the cage. He rose to his feet, wincing as his muscles protested after being cramped for so long. He looked around the room, but even from this perspective there still wasn't anything special about it. It remained a storage room where things were left and forgotten about until someone came and acknowledged their existence. Dust coated many of the boxes, and shelves lining the walls were filled with cluttered bottles, books, and old weapons. He remembered that the room they'd first been in had been something like a bar setup. It all seemed like an odd choice for a villain hideout, but at the same time wasn't very conspicuous. So they had that going for them. The student eyed Dabai warily as he took a few steps across the room. He shifted in his seat, but again left him alone, although it was evident that his hands were ready to blast fire if he made a wrong move. The villain didn't look that much older than himself, but his tired eyes and deliberate movements spoke of his experience. Whatever he'd been through in his life had molded him into a potentially frightening adversary. The last thing Tokoyami wanted was to mess with him, especially with his poor quirk compatibility. He stopped and reached down into a container filled with plastic water bottles, unscrewing the cap and drinking from the side of his beak. He had no way of knowing how much time had passed since the attack in the forest, but he was horribly thirsty at this point. The villain fiddled with a bottle cap. It looked like he wanted to say something, but was waiting until he was done. Only when Tokoyami emptied the bottle with a sigh and dropped it back into the box did he begin talking. "I'm going to level with you, Bird. We actually don't know what to do with you." The other student, well, we've seen enough of his personality to know that he'd make a great villain. Everyone's thinking that, too, not just us. I'm sure you've thought the same thing. Tokoyami nodded begrudgingly. He hated that they were right, but he couldn't so easily forget the explosive boy's raw power and anger during the sports festival. Of course he had been such a prime target. So then what does that make me? "But you're pretty impressive yourself," he continued. "At least, your quirk is anyway. We don't know the first thing about you except from what was seen of the tournament. I suppose you mean to flatter me, but I promise my quirk isn't that great," Tokoyami grumbled. His quirk hissed in his mind, hurt by the comment directed at it. Dabai laughed at that, a hoarse sound that scraped from his burned throat. "Yeah, well, others are thinking differently. And if we're to take Compress's word for it, then there's much more to it than what most people know from your televised performance." He stood from his seat and stretched, coming to stand much taller than the rather short-statured student. "Buit, that's neither here nor there. Would be cool if you could control it, though there's other ways of getting a hold of a quirk." "I don't like what you're saying." "There's nothing wrong with Dark Shadow. You people just have a misconception of it." "Is that so? In that case, do feel free to explain it to the group. Better yet, use it on me right now." His calm demeanor had quickly turned serious, and the villain stared him down with such insistence that Tokoyami knew he couldn't meet his challenge. "This is hardly the place to be acting so carelessly," Tokoyami muttered. "Then that makes you smarter than the other one." Dabai tousled his messy black hair, slipping back into the laid-back facade that concealed a burning threat. In that case, you want to see the situation in the other room, right? Same rules apply. Don't cause any trouble and nothing bad happens. This new proposition surprised him. He hadn't considered that the scarred villain would be so lenient with his watch over him, especially after the first impression of being stuffed into a cage. He briefly wondered if this was a trap of some sort, but that wouldn't serve to progress whatever plans they might have. He was already within their control. If the villain alliance wanted something, he would hardly be able to do anything about it. And although he was hesitant to take the words of a villain, Tokoyami wanted to believe that nothing would befall him so long as he did what he was told for now. And so long as Dark Shadow also does what it's told. In the end, the jet black hero didn't see how he could refuse this offer and nodded in agreement. Dabai smiled, causing the crinkled skin and surgical staples keeping his face together to contort in a way that looked painful. "We're glad to have you join us this evening. Come on over this way." He walked over and opened the door back up, waving the bird-headed boy through into a whole new field of threatening faces. Tokoyami stepped through into the room that they had all first arrived in, the villain charged with looking after him close behind. He glanced around, his feathers prickling with unease. Now that the space had calmed down and he was free to observe the surroundings, he could take note of it. Just as he thought, it was a generic bar space, with a long counter running along the wall protecting shelves of cheap alcohol. Behind it stood the familiar villain that had been identified as Kurogiri after the Esch incident, busying himself by cleaning up broken bottles that had been thrown his way at some point. Despite his general lack of emotion, he looked tired, his hazy purple mist less lively. The walls were plastered with old and partially destroyed posters featuring pro-heroes. Some heroes from the past he didn't recognize had large gouges taken out of them or XS marked across their faces. One featuring All Might stood out the most, with 3 long scars marring the picture of the symbol of peace. Mounted to his right was a television turned onto the news channel and muted. For a moment there was a UF faculty member being interviewed, but he couldn't understand what was going on. He assumed that the reports of the attack in the forest had spread fast, though. Tokoyami wondered if his classmates had made it out all right. He couldn't forget the image of Midoriya and the rest reaching out to them, injured and desperate. But it went without saying that the ones he should be worrying about the most right now were him and the other student trapped here in this room. For sitting in the center of the room surrounded by villains was Bakugo, restrained much in the same way as he was during the awards ceremony after the tournament. His hands, the source of his brutal power, were once again weighed down by heavy concrete blocks, and a gag had been tied over his mouth, probably to stop the cursing and death threats that were being directed at the villains. Last time the boy had been restrained like this, he had radiated anger and intimidation. Now you could still see the rage written across his face, but he was decisively more subdued, shaking quietly with suppressed emotions in an uncharacteristic way. It was almost sad to see. Tokoyami hoped that he had the sense to stay put. Bakugo was smart, an excellent student and even better fighter. But the way that he let his emotions get the best of him in the past could prove to be consequential for the both of them. One-sided conversation between the villains and the student came to a halt when the room noticed his presence. All eyes turned on him, suspicious and judgmental. When Bakugo caught sight of him walking freely, he scowled, becoming visibly angrier. He brought that upon himself. Dark Shadow laughed in his mind, and Tokoyami found himself agreeing, although he'd never tell that to the quirk. "Hey, Dabai, what the hell?" hissed the reptilian Stain impersonator, reacting immediately. "We already have our hands full with this one." Shigaraki let out an exasperated sigh. "You were supposed to keep that extra in the back so that we can do something with him later." He sat down in a bar stool and compulsively began scratching at his neck, which was already red and scarred from a particularly stressful night. Kurogiri slid a drink his way, but it was left untouched on the counter. "It's fine," No harm, no foul, Dabai said, smiling at his own pun. No one else was laughing. Look, don't worry about it. He's not going to do anything. So I decided that he didn't need to be left out of this. Is that a problem? He challenged. For all you know, the kid could be lulling you into a false sense of security, mumbled the imposing lady he'd heard them refer to as Magni. You don't know what he's capable of. I have a pretty good idea, and I'm not concerned. That sounded like a slight against him. But Tokoyami wasn't about to take it personally. Not in the state he was in. His quirk was greater and more complex than anything they could possibly understand. But he wasn't about to brag about that anytime soon. Hopefully, if they let him be, then they'd never have to know about the internal turmoil that had been going on between him and Dark Shadow. How could you be so quick to trust the new kid? I don't know about that. He might end up fitting in, said Twice, although his words came off as confusing. I hear that crows make great pets, giggled the schoolgirl that looked no older than himself. She stared him down with intense yellow eyes filled with animalistic instinct, like she would happily attack him without warning. It made him uncomfortable, and he hoped he wasn't showing how agitated he was to be back here surrounded by all these unfriendly faces. Usually he could keep his calm better than anyone, and was happy to be the voice of reason in the classroom. But this was hardly a normal situation to be in. Sure, whatever, just so long as the brat doesn't get in the way. If anything goes wrong because of him, it'll be your fault, Dabai, Shigaraki growled. His eyes gleamed from between the stiff fingers of the gray hand covering his face, appraising the hero in training that had become their unexpected captive. Everyone can stop hovering around the explosion boy. Maybe he'll be ready to cooperate after we pick apart this fumigage, is it? The villains dispersed, leaning against walls, sitting at the bar, and crashing on a couch in the corner, leaving behind the restrained Bakugo in the center of the room. But they were all watching and listening, intent to see what would happen next. This was all some kind of spectacle to them, but one they worked damn hard to see happen. Third place in the tournament, if I recall correctly. We're doing great until you went up against the kid we have over there. He nodded vaguely towards Bakugo, who was now staring angrily down at his imprisoned hands. Some kind of sentient shadow power, and Mr. Compress tells me it's much greater than anything I saw on screen. That true? Mr. Compress adjusted his mask from where he sat nervously. You should have seen it. There was such devastating power, and I want to hear it from him. The head villain swiveled in his barstool to face Tokoyami directly. But if you piss me off or prove that you're of no use to me, then you better have a damn good reason for why I shouldn't obliterate you on the spot. You don't have to intimidate him, he's just a kid, Kurogiri chided. So's the other one. And look who's left cleaning up the destructive little monster's mess. Ha, they think your classmate is the monster here. Dark Shadow laughed, intruding his thoughts once again. If only they knew. You'll just have to show them what you're capable of. Tokoyami didn't justify his quirk with a response, but it was becoming harder to split his attention between the two forces pressuring him on either side. Kurogiri sighed in passive defeat, but went ahead and beckoned him over to a seat at the bar that was several feet away from the irate Shigaraki. Tokoyami took the seat, and the misty purple figure served him a glass of water. For a villain that had done so much damage at the USG and, from the accounts of other students, had almost succeeded in tearing All Might in half, he was surprisingly level-minded, a stark contrast to Shigaraki, who came of as impulsive and lacking patience. He wasn't sure what to make of all the others. Whatever the case, he needed to tread carefully lest he inadvertently anger any one of them by saying something careless. He doubted Bakugo would hold the same sentiment, but that didn't matter now that all interest was on him. Go on, no reason to be shy, right? Tokoyami glanced over his shoulder in uncertainty. The one responsible for bringing him out here was leaning against the wall scrolling through a phone absent-mindedly. Dabai noticed and glanced up from his screen, raising an eyebrow. As strange as it was, the student found him to be much more approachable. At the very least, the many-handed creep seated before him was most unwelcoming, and he could only hope that he wouldn't do anything harming to him. Although they were all villains with records to back up their misdeeds, the fact that some of them had expressed what might have been concern was a bit comforting. He hoped that Shigaraki's threat wasn't anything fulfillable, so long as other villains held different views against him. Despite being called an alliance, he doubted that this strange group was capable of total camaraderie. Right. He started reluctantly, uncertain of how much he'd have to give away about himself before they were satisfied. My quirk. Dark Shadow is a sentient being that I control for combat. And is useful and multipurpose. Tokoyami grimaced, clenching his hands in his lap. The villain staring him down was tapping his fingers against the counter. That's great. But I already understand the gist of it from what I've already seen. Tell me what you did to Moonfish. My incredibly strong, albeit psychotic, ally. He's either dead or in custody thanks to you. Don't get me wrong, I'm not mad about that. I'll be angrier if I were to find out that he lost to a bunch of pushovers. But that doesn't sound like the case. So what the hell did you do, Bird? I don't suppose you would believe me if I said that I was just holding back during the tournament. Shigaraki hummed in contemplation, but his scratchy voice made it sound like more of a growl. Maybe I would have if it weren't so obvious that you had a weakness and a strength. But I could potentially understand why it wouldn't do a person any good to make a scene on live television. Can never be sure what attracting all that attention can land you. Isn't that right, Bakugo? The tied-up student didn't respond, so he directed his focus back to Tokoyami. So out with it. What made your quirk go off like it did? Dabai says you're weak to fire and explosions. First Bakugo, and then the villains. Tokoyami's weaknesses were becoming more and more obvious to the people he'd never want to reveal them to. And it was a disheartening realization. It was also something he couldn't avoid disclosing with the person he now faced. They already had the answer. All that was needed was his confirmation. And he didn't want to provide an unsatisfactory answer. Yes, my quirk. It is indeed less powerful before such obstacles. What people usually see is a tamer version of what its power truly encompasses. While still capable during such conditions, its true power comes out under the veil of darkness. Shigaraki considered that, taking in what was just said. So at night, then, makes sense. But something tells me that it isn't all of it. Surely you don't unleash the kind of power that can defeat a powerful foe every time the sun sets. So what made tonight so special? It sounds like you destroyed half the forest. Toga giggled from her seat on the couch. Ooh, Tilda, that sounds evil. Maybe you're better off with us, huh? That's a bit much. I don't remember that. Tokoyami turned his head away. A kid can't destroy a forest. My quirk is only... Show me. Tokoyami tensed. He'd been dreading this moment, had been hoping that after Bakugo had caused them so much trouble that they wouldn't bother with him. And as Shigaraki's demand hung in the air, he hardened his resolution. I refuse, he stated in a firm, monotonous tone. Even with everything that was going on around him, unleashing his quirk was the one thing he could not afford to do. Shigaraki narrowed his eyes. And why would you do that? If I wanted to, I could bend you to my will whenever I want. To deny me is childish and futile. Tokoyami hung his head lower, feeling thoroughly driven into a corner and afraid to speak again. There was no going back from this. He just didn't want to say. The kid can't control his quirk. Everyone turned their attention to where Dabai had spoken up, and newfound interest arose as the villains began to piece everything together. Dabai looked back up from his phone, the staples holding his skin together glowing from the blue light of the screen. What? It seems obvious. Or maybe it's just from my perspective. But that quirk literally has a mind of its own. He stuck his phone into his pocket and slid down against the wall until he was sitting on the ground. Maybe he's uncertain, unstable, unwilling. Perhaps this shadow can sense his fear. Whatever the case, I don't think it's smart to demand him to use it now. I'm sure he'll loosen up eventually, though. Tokoyami tried to read the expressions of the people around him, but couldn't focus on a single one. After having his insecurities exposed, he suddenly felt much smaller. And yet a part of him was grateful that he didn't have to be the one to say it. He couldn't tell if this made his position more or less dangerous, however, and in the end he was reduced to tolerating this uncertainty once more. The sound of agitated scratching brought him back to the most crucial part of this conversation. Shigaraki was at it again, digging his nails into the raw skin of his neck. Not quite angry, but something else, more calculating. So, can we use him or not? Because I swear if it's going to be this way with a damn quirk, I never asked for. I swear I will send him to master, just so that we can be done with it. If the kid can't use his quirk, then what's the point? Tokoyami didn't understand the part about the master, or why he would be sent there. But suddenly everyone else in the room had been put on edge, and the atmosphere had changed. Dabai leaned forward. Hey now. You're right. Don't be so damn cruel, Tamura. Twice sprung up from his seat, a decisively determined look on his masked face. You better not have a problem with someone struggling with the duality of their quirk. Because if you do, he struck a pose, jabbing his thumb at himself. Then you better have something to say to me. I can teach this kid right. I don't think he has what it takes, Spinner scoffed. How do you even know you have what it takes? Whatever that's supposed to mean, Magni challenged. Spinner pouted and crossed his arms over his polka-dot shirt. Because I follow in the path of the mighty stain. How could anything lead me astray? Then you should teach him, Toga said, excitement evident in her unnaturally cheery voice. He can be a great villain. He just needs our help is all. Shigaraki sighed in resignation. What is this, a pet project? Fine then, he's your responsible. But if he crosses us on your terms, there will be hell to pay. So Fumikage, count yourself lucky that I care more about Bakugo. Because if I were left to deal with you, only it might not have worked so well in your favor. Tokoyami wasn't sure how to respond to all this. He could never approve of being taught by villains. But as far as he was concerned, he was safe for now. This arrangement didn't make him feel any more comfortable. But if he could roll with it for now, then it definitely wasn't the worst thing. They might understand you more than any hero ever could. Tokoyami scowled. I didn't ask you. Hey, that's a scary face you have there, Shigaraki rasped. Didn't you hear me? Go play with the others. I'm done talking with you. I'd rather negotiate with someone who actually has the conviction to use their quirk. So you better not interrupt me while I'm trying to level with Bakugo, or there will be hell to pay. Shigaraki left his place at the bar and pulled up a seat in front of Bakugo, who refused to look up to meet him straight on. Yet another indication of his uncooperation. Even small things like that was enough to annoy the villain, as he tried to earn the students' devotion with spiels of taking action and being better than any hero. Tokoyami felt guilt wash over him, for the better treatment he'd been receiving, for how he was in a much more stable situation after these villains had actually rallied at his side. It was unprecedented, absurd. He was no more like these evildoers than his fellow classmates, and yet they were so quick to defend him. What made it worse was that he was grateful for it. He accepted what they had to offer without nearly so much struggling as Bakugo was. He was restrained and resilient, fighting back on what they had to say to the point where he had to have his mouth gagged. Tokoyami could have done more to resist them. Better yet, maybe he could have fought them when he had the opportunity. Even if it was dangerous and futile, at least it would show that he was resisting them. That's what he should be doing instead of sitting amongst them so casually. And yet, I can probably find you something to eat if you're hungry, Kurogiri whispered from behind the bar. Do forgive our inhospitality thus far. And no, it's fine. Tokoyami took a tentative sip of the glass of water he'd been given earlier. A finger tapped on his shoulder, causing him to splutter and whip around quickly on the stool. arm raised defensively. The villain twice jumped back, palms open to show he meant no harm. Oh, hi. Hello. Just making sure you're doing all right there, kiddo. He lowered his hands slowly. Are you? Not sure I truly can be, Tokoyami said, eyes narrowed in suspicion. Twice was still waiting for an answer, and it didn't seem like he meant any ill will. Yeah, no, I'm fine. But I don't know what you people expect from me. Oh, don't worry about that. Here, come join us on the couch. We don't bite, I promise. Well, I don't anyway. Tokoyami wanted to turn him down, to show any kind of defiance against anyone who would dare to call themselves a villain. But this guy was so genuine. Perhaps gaining their trust was the best option after all, as opposed to Bakugu's show of resilience at every turn. Tokoyami slid off the barstool, looking the villain up and down cautiously. The guy's gray bodysuit, which looked like it was taken straight out of a comic book, was ripped and burned in some places. He wasn't able to see any of the fighting that went on while in his immobilized, captured state. But there was no doubt that this villain had been fighting against his classmates. And yet, at the moment, he didn't seem malicious. So Tokoyami followed him over to the corner with the beat-up furniture. This appeared to make him happy, though Tokoyami didn't understand him. All these villains were strange countermeasures against society. And although it didn't appear as though they'd do anything against him, he was still troubled to be amongst them. Despite the unusually friendly invitation, he was still very much on edge. But he sat down with them anyway, on the very opposite end of where the high school girl was sitting. He jammed his elbow against the armrest and rested his head on his hand, flicking his attention warily between the villains to his left and Shigaraki's speech in the center of the room. When he looked over discreetly to where Toga had been once more, he could swear that she had shifted closer to him. He hunched his shoulders defensively, sinking deeper into the worn-down fabric of the couch. With another side glance, she was now only a cushion space away. He considered sitting on the floor when Twice sat down between them. Tokoyami sighed in what might have been relief, and the gray-suited villain looked over at him curiously, twiddling his fingers in his lap absent-mindedly. So tell me about yourself, Twice said. Tokoyami didn't respond. That shouldn't have come as a surprise. Probably not the best timing, man. Dabai strode over and sat on the armrest on Toga's side of the couch. You might want to just leave him alone. He'll come around. Maybe it would be better if he knew what we're all about first before you go pressuring him. Twice put his fist in his palm, like this was some remarkable idea. Oh, I get it. Don't confuse me. He turned to Tokoyami. We're the evil-villain alliance. We're great people, though, I promise. Dabai muttered something under his breath that went largely ignored. So you're having trouble with your quirk, huh? I used to be like that. My quirk lets me make copies of people. I used to use it on myself, but not anymore since it got out of hand. Tokoyami acknowledged the villain. How so? He asked, curious now. Twice leaned forward. Well, just between you and me, I was having a hard time differentiating between myself and who I think I might be. How do I explain? It's like all these intrusive thoughts fill your head, and you can't tell if it's you or someone else saying it. If I clone myself, it's still me. But it's not because I'm me, except now I'm not even sure of that. Tokoyami regarded him strangely. Who was this person, truly, to be telling him all this? So, you understand, right? You're confused, I can tell. The student listened to hear if Dark Shadow had anything to say, but the quirk had been silent all throughout the exchange. No or yes. I see where you're coming from. My Dark Shadow is usually very good at compromising. But he also has a lot of resolve, sometimes more than I. And it can be difficult at times when we have conflicting thoughts. Twice nodded thoughtfully. It was strange to be telling him all this. The others were probably all listening in as well, depending on how much they cared. He never thought he would be disclosing this type of information. He never had before, not to any of the heroes he learned under. or the classmates he trained with. But that's hardly important, Tokoyami growled. I'm training to become a hero. Why would I want to be anything else? I can hardly comprehend why anyone would want to commit themselves to doing wrong and harming others for selfish reasons. No, don't think of it like that. We all have our own reasons for being here, Twice said, waving his hands around. I was having a hard time out there where heroes control everything. I couldn't think straight or live right. It's the va that's more tolerable to others than the people out there in society that don't have to worry about themselves. Heroes strive for a just society where everyone can live in peace. You can't possibly think that you're better than them, the student said, his memories of idealizing and training in the wake of amazing heroes making his words come easy. Dabai sighed. I know you're just a kid, but you really should know better. You're wrong if you think that everyone is treated fairly out there, regardless of whether or not they do good. It's not like it was that long ago where quirk users with unhuman qualities were discriminated against. People with unique skin colors, mutations, or animal features were looked down upon for the longest time when quirks first started appearing. Even now the laws and society have loopholes and gaps. Hell, even before quirks were discovered, people like Magni would be treated differently. History always repeats itself. No one is equal. We all get treated differently. And if you're not careful, you'll end up getting burned by the very same people who swore to protect you. The sooner you understand that, the better. You got that, bird? Of course I understand that, damn it. But you didn't have to say it. Damn those people. How dare they humiliate us? Tokoyami pondered this. It was true that this was nothing new. A thing of the past that people like to think had remained there. But the cruelty in people's hearts remained there even through generations. His mom had told him that when he was younger. And yet he was so accepted within the walls of UA as a powerful and capable student that he had perhaps forgotten. It doesn't matter. That's what heroes are here to stop. So that people can be happy. That's unrealistic. Oh. No hero would ever come to your side. A lot of us came here brought together by Stain's ideals. He wanted to revolutionize the way that heroes perform, to go back to being selfless icons that fought for others instead of themselves. Dabai continued. Spinner over there is a devout follower, if you couldn't tell. I personally can't stand the popularized heroes with their sense of entitlement, as though they're above the law. It's annoying to have to follow a set of rules that aren't even upheld by the one who create them. I have far more respect for vigilantes. And then Toga, well, she's screwy, and maybe not the most innocent. But that's just how it is when you desire to use your quirk in a world that won't let you. Tokoyami lifted his head up and looked to where the girl had been sitting not moments before. She had left her seat without him even noticing. A sharp pain in his arm alluded him to her presence, now directly below him on the other side of the armrest. A small blade had been used to cut his exposed flesh, and a drop of his blood now adorned it. He watched her stand up triumphantly, dripping the blood into a small vial and putting it into her pocket. For safekeeping, she said menacingly, a smile written on her face. Tokoyami gripped his arm begrudgingly as she made her way back to her seat and plopped back down. You didn't have to do that, Dabai chastised. And you don't know that for sure, she sang right back. Ignore her, Twice said. Or rather don't. She's just as much a part of this group. We're a strange bunch, most definitely. But then again, so are you. As long as you're here with us, you might as well make the most of it, right? Tokoyami relaxed his shoulders. Somehow, he didn't care as much what happened anymore. It all seemed so inevitable. He looked over again at Bakugo, still sitting silently before the intimidating Shigaraki. He leaned his head back into the couch, listening in on the villain leader's talk of freedom and respect, of a world that's been led astray because of today's heroes, and further pondered his situation. Right. Now I'm going to let you speak, Shigaraki said to Bakugo. He beckoned for Mr. Compress to come forward and take off the cloth that had been keeping his sharp tongue in check. And after everything I've said, I want you to answer honestly. What say you become one of us?" Everyone turned their attention to him as he was given the ability to speak once more, waiting in deep-set anticipation. Bakugo tilted his head up as the gag was removed. His brow was furrowed, and a perverse smile stretched across his face. "How about you choke on those words and die?" Tokoyami felt his heart sink. Despite everything, his abrasive nature was still as prevalent as ever. "He could jeopardize us all." Around him, the rest of the villain alliance rose from their respective places to confront the boy. Tokoyami stayed smartly where he was. Shigaraki sighed, much like an adult trying to teach a child so naive as to not understand even the most basic of facts. "After all I've said, you still intend on acting like this? I thought you were smarter than this. Your friend over there gets it, but everything seems to go right over your head. I don't get it." Bakugo narrowed his eyes at the classmate sitting comfortably on the couch. Tokoyami couldn't meet his gaze, not because he felt guilty, but more so because his gaze was so scathing. "Don't lump us together. I'm stronger in every way than him. You can't convince me so easily with your shitty monologues." "Bakugo, I would have hoped that you'd know as well as I do that that's not what's going on. But of course you of all people would go out of your way to be so presumptuous. How am I ever going to work with you like this? Even in the place I'm in, you seem to be consumed by your own darkness, so don't do this to me." He's his own weakness, truly. He doesn't belong anywhere with his outlandish pride. Not as a villain and definitely not as a hero. "So you say. But then what would that make me?" On the television, Tokoyami could see a board of familiar teachers answering questions in the aftermath of the damage that was done. Despite being muted, subtitles on the bottom read of them, apologizing for their shortcomings and taking strong measures to ensure the safety of our students. And yet that didn't feel very comforting. Were they even doing anything to find their missing students? Was there anything to do at all? For all he knew, they had no way of seeking them out and had decided to settle on cutting their losses. Tokoyami wondered how long he would be here, alongside the other outcasts of the world. "You're starting to identify with these people, aren't you?" "Stop it, no. But I can at least sympathize with them." Shigaraki's voice was getting more insistent. The strangeness of converting human life into money and selfish pursuits, and a society that codifies that type of thinking into its rules, citizens that criticize the underdogs of this world instead of cheering them on. Our battle is one of questions. What is a hero and what is justice? Is this society really just? We want each and every individual to think about these things. We intend to win this battle." He leaned forward, closer to Bakugo. "You like winning, don't you?" This time, instead of waiting for a response, he turned to Dabai. "Take off his bindings." Tokoyami jerked to attention, hands gripping tightly on the seat of the couch. But that movement went largely ignored as everyone else responded with general surprise. "What? Hell no, this guy's going to go ballistic." It was a pain in the ass as it was to get him like that. "Besides, I'm already in charge of the other one," Dabai said. Shigaraki opened his arms wide in what could have been a welcoming gesture. Unfortunately, the power behind his hands made it feel much more like a threat. "It's okay. It seems like the best we can do is to treat him as an equal. We're dead set on scouting him, after all." "Did you reach that conclusion after we had to stand up for Tokoyami?" Dabai growled just loud enough for him to hear. The villain brushed his words aside. "Besides, he should be able to tell from the current situation that he has no possible way of winning if he were to go off here." "Right, U.S. student." "All right, then," Dabai sighed. "Twice, free him." "What, me? No thanks," he responded vehemently, even as he bent down to unshackle the heavy concrete blocks encasing Bakugo's frightening hands. Mr. Compressed decided then that it was his turn to offer up some meaningful words. "I do apologize to the both of you for taking such a forceful approach with you. However, Please understand that we're not just a group of hoodlums endeavoring to perpetuate evil acts. We didn't just casually decide to abduct you. It could be seen clear as day the impact this sort of world had on you and Tokoyami. With a clatter, the stone shackles fell to the ground, leaving Bakugo to rub his aching wrists begrudgingly. Shigaraki stepped towards the quiet student. Everyone here has different circumstances, but people, rules, heroes, we're all shackled by them. This is what Dabai and Twice were saying not too long ago. They all feel so strongly about this. Don't you ever feel the same? Or are you content to spend the rest of your life wandering blindly through the darkness? You're the darkness I wade through the most, so you would know. That doesn't sound like disagreement, Tilda. You should be tired of living under the people who demonize and ostracize you. You of all people should understand. Bakugo reared up and out of his seat without warning, reaching out to deliver a well-placed explosion right to the villain leader's chest. Everyone was on guard in a second, ready and willing to suppress him once more. Tokoyami lurched from his seat as well, but gave no further indication that he was going to do more. Toga saw this, her knife blade flashing out of her sleeve, but she left him alone to focus on the one causing the ruckus. I stayed quiet and listened to you run your mouth on and on. Idiots like you never know how to summarize. All I can gather is that you're trying to make people hate you. So you're begging me for help, right? Spare me your pity party, it's pointless. The student stood tall, brandishing his hands readily while surrounded by villains. Filled with pride and smiling with pseudo-confidence, he declared to the world, I've already been won over by the way All Might looks when he wins. You all can say what you want, but nothing can change my mind about that. In the commotion, two trivial yet important things had happened. For one, the hand covering Shigaraki Tamura's face had been blasted off, and he gazed at it down on the floor with an unreadable expression. Secondly, someone had knocked the TV and caused it to unmute, leading to the discussion of the kidnapped students being broadcast for all to hear. News reporters were making claims to the teacher's irresponsibility, but also, they were bringing up why they had been targeted. Strong contenders in the tournament. Incredible quirks with deadly repercussions regarding the violent tendencies behind them. All coming to a head by Bakugo's brutal nature and Tokoyami's instability in the forest as driving factors. These people, they must be thinking that we're prime candidates for villains. Are they wrong? And then a promise from the principal rang through. We will absolutely get our students back. See? Bakugo declared triumphantly. You heard what they said, and that's how it's going to be. But until then, I'm going to make some damage here. I'm telling you now, my combat authorizations haven't been revoked. Got it? That goes for you too, Tokoyami. That earned the raven-headed student some cautious looks from the villains. But still he didn't understand what he had to gain from any of this and refused to budge. So they turned back to the immediate threat, though they didn't seem all that concerned after the initial shock and disgust amongst themselves. Magni. He understands exactly what position he's in. What a clever boy. Toga. Let's stab him. Dabai. No, I think he's just an idiot. Mr. Compress. He could have at least pretended to be won over. He messed up. Why do you have to always be like this, Bakugo? Bakugo glared at everyone in the room, ready to go off should anyone challenge him. I'm not about to lie about things I don't want to do. I also don't plan on staying here much longer, if you catch my drift. While this was happening, Shigaraki was reaching down to retrieve the gnarled, gray hand that had been sent flying to the ground. It wasn't immediately recognizable, but judging by everyone's cautiousness, the villain stooping to pick up the hand was livid. When he spoke, it was with a scathing coldness. If possible, I would have liked for you to hear me out. I thought that just maybe I could get it through your thick skull in a way that would make you understand. Bakugo smirked in all his false bravado. And no chance. Shigaraki let out a shuddered breath as he returned the grizzled hand to his face. Then I have no choice. The heroes are searching for you, and I can't afford to be wasting time trying to convince you. He lifted his head towards a black monitor. Master, I'll need your help this time around. There it was again, the mention of a master. Someone with a position of power even higher than Shigaraki in the villain alliance. The villain had first mentioned him when threatening to send Tokoyami to this unknown person of significance in order to be done with it, whatever that entailed. It didn't give him any comfort. There was no way of knowing what this master was all about, but he doubted it was good. Even then, this was not the time and place to be making a scene. Why Bakugo had to cause trouble for the both of them was inconceivable. It's all his fault that we're in this situation in the first place. Because he can never just keep his damn emotions in check. But isn't that the same thing that got you wrapped up in all this, Fumikage? Admit it, you're weak. Bakugo let off a warning blast to the villains surrounding him. Just you try to do anything to me. No way I'll let you tie me down again. No more tricks. We'll take you all down. Tokoyami tensed. We. His classmate's cocky smile faltered for a moment. Yeah, these guys are nothing. Let's decimate them so that the pro heroes don't have to worry anymore. We'll walk out of here and be praised for our bravery. That's what a hero would do, blow these evil punks to smithereens. The dark-feathered boy didn't budge from where he was standing, and Bakugo saw that for some incomprehensible reason his classmate was not joining him at his side. Tokoyami had his reasons, though, but he doubted the hothead would pay him any heed. You're just going to blast me too. You don't stand a chance on your own, and I don't stand a chance if I choose to fight next to you. You're a fool if you think that things will work in your favor. But even if I told you that, I doubt you would listen. Bakugo was visibly angry now, but not at the villains driving him into a corner. Damn it, Tokoyami, why don't you move? How dare you even pretend for a moment that you're on their side? Stop being so weak. I'm not weak, Tokoyami growled from his beak. The villains began to circle in on the explosive student. Mr. Compress looking ready to store him back into a marble so that he won't be able to do any further harm. Then prove it. Show me by leveling this entire shithole. Otherwise, I'll make sure to leave you behind in the rubble after I demolish this place myself. Tokoyami was quivering now, not in fear, but with rage, the kind of which fueled the very student that was verbally lashing out at him now. I'm so sick of him, said a voice that could have been either Tokoyami or Dark Shadow. Do something now, or I'll bury you with the rest of these villains. It was easy provocation. He knew as much. Whether or not he meant what he said, Tokoyami had reached his limit. All night he had felt helpless and restrained, while simultaneously being pressured to bring out his quirk like it was so easy. Like it's so goddamn easy as that. Dark Shadow had been steadily eating away at his consciousness since losing control. Even though it shouldn't have been all that long since then, he couldn't refuse it anymore. Consequences be damned. He was ready to unleash hell. I'll show you power, Bakugo. I'll never let you upstage me again. Tokoyami took a stance and in his mind unlocked the cage that had been holding back an increasingly disturbed monster. Dark Shadow welcomed his newfound freedom, bursting from the limitations of his body. Yellow eyes flashed before Tokoyami as Dark Shadow escaped from him with such ferocity that the floor beneath his feet splintered from the force. The image of an enormous shadowy bird filled the room, causing the lights to flicker and dim and everyone to gaze up in horror at the creature that had emerged from small, previously subdued kid. Dark Shadow's claws raked the walls, shredding the posters of heroes and villains that adorned them. A thin, reedy voice escaped its hooked beak, loud enough to shake the very bones of everyone present. I fight for no one. Dabai rushed forward with his flames, intent on subduing the beast. Mr. Compress also stepped up, although he was clearly terrified behind his mask, as though afraid that he'd lose an arm in all this. Bakugo stepped back quickly as wall plaster and poster scraps rained down on him, letting out a blast that seemed only to anger the sentient quirk further. Shigaraki was calling out to his master for support. Spinner of all people had backed up against the door, what looked like the exit, to escape the ensuing chaos. And he was the only one who noticed when a knock sounded on that very door, followed by a strangely chipper, "Hello, anyone home?" A powerful blast crumbled the entire wall from the outside as a new presence entered himself into the fray. Dark Shadow shielded Tokoyami from the blast and roared at the unannounced intruder. The quirk lashed out at everything that moved, flicking Dabai aside easily, brushing aside Bakugu's explosion, and finally setting its sight on this new challenger with a vengeance. "It's fine now, for I am H." Dark Shadow slammed him into the far wall with his wicked claws, and with such unsurmountable violence that the whole hideout no longer resembled a livable environment. A strangled cry of surprise and pain sounded from where the hero that had come for them had been unceremoniously smashed into the foundation. "All Might, what happened?" came a voice as heroes streamed through the hole where the door had once been, ready and willing to take on whatever dastardly villains would dare to attack them. Dark Shadow turned away from the damage it had caused, uncaring as it turned to all the shocked villains and heroes alike. Fresh blood glistened from its claws. "Look what you made us do," it laughed with sick pleasure. "No, stop. You've done enough, Dark Shadow." Tokoyami screamed up at the quirk, while trying desperately to reel it back into the mental cage that would keep it at bay. But as Tokoyami looked on in horror, he knew that the worst possible damage had already been dealt. In an unforgivable act of what could only be seen as treachery, Fumikage Tokoyami had accidentally laid waste to the symbol of peace, All Might. Tokoyami was trembling at what his actions had caused. The walls that Dark Shadow had destroyed were now piles of rubble, under which laid the person on which all hope rested. His quirk flicked fresh blood unapologetically from its claws, sneering down at all the villains and heroes that were now viewing it in all its horrible power. Worst of all was the student's inability to subdue the colossal shadow beast himself, his mental instability a weakness in the eyes of the sentient beast. A voice, garbled, and not at all like the Dark Shadow he was accustomed to, spoke to him and only him. Hey, you should be proud that you're able to show how strong you are to all your peers. Dark Shadow, you need to stop. This isn't what I wanted." The quirk hunched down and turned to glare at its master with disappointed amber eyes. Everyone stay down. An intertwining web of heavy branches came seemingly from nowhere and pinned the dark monstrosity to the ground with intentional force. Kamui Woods worked brazenly to get the situation under control, but his focus was on the thing wreaking the most havoc. "All Might, are you okay?" The villains were already beginning to adapt to the situational changes, unexpected as they were. Dabai lashed out at the hero, black flames rising readily from his hands to burn away the source of the wooden cage. "You think wood will," he began to say, but he was swiftly dealt with as Gran Torino knocked him into the ground with a well-placed kick. "Behave if you know what's good for you," the aged hero growled. He landed nimbly and looked to where All Might had been sent crashing into the wall. "We can't afford to falter, All Might. Can you still fight?" A fist broke through the pile of debris, and the hero hoisted himself up. He was smiling, as usual, but it felt pained and hard to maintain. His other hand clutched his side, where blood could be very visibly seen, and yet he stood tall and proud, as though he hadn't just been horribly injured by his own student. Justice always prevails. Something like this is nothing. Tokoyami fell to his knees, awash with exhaustion and shame. He internally begged his quirk to recede, to go back. But while it faltered and decreased in size, it would not completely listen to him. More heroes and military forces filed through what was now multiple holes, exposing the lair of the villain alliance, which was now in shambles. Everyone was disoriented from the succession of events and the unexpected ferocity that was Dark Shadow. But it had hit the villains hardest, and they were quickly suppressed through the efforts of the dispatched rescue team. Dark Shadow growled at all the people swarming the building. "Stay clear of it until it can be dealt with," All Might shouted. With little warning, a fiery red fist connected with the shadowy mass, burning away the wooden cage and the seething darkness within, leaving behind the crackle of embers and a hiss of dejection. Tokoyami sighed in relief as the sight of his quirk dissipated into nothing. But in his mind, it was still adamantly voicing its complaints, and he wished desperately for it to stop. The persecutor of his quirk turned to face him. It was the number 2 hero, Endeavor, his hands twin fists of fire ready to be used at a moment's notice. "I thought you'd have this under control, but I guess not," Endeavor growled. All Might laughed, although it was evident that it caused him pain. "Nonsense. Sure, this took an unexpected turn, but there was no need for you to intervene." His voice became more personal as he delivered a reminder to the hero. "In any case, you're supposed to be outside in case anyone tries to escape. I had this under control." Endeavor huffed in response, in doubt of All Might's claim. But as it was, all of the villains were now either secured by cuffs or tightly bound by the ability of Kamui Woods, who was muttering about how much effort he'd had to put into pinning down Dark Shadow, just to have it be burned away so easily by Endeavor's hellflame. The many people of the rescue team were calling back and forth to each other, taking account of the situation. It was jarring how quickly everything had changed. Bakugu started to stand nearby, having hit the ground hard to avoid the rampage that he had inadvertently caused. All Might was by his side in a moment, offering the student a hand that was gratefully accepted. He was trembling ever so slightly as All Might gave him a reassuring thumbs up. "It must have been scary, but you did well to endure. I'm sorry this ever happened to you, my boy. Everything is okay now." Bakugu stayed uncharacteristically silent. Was there really anything that needed to be said in this situation? But that didn't stop Shigaraki from speaking up instead. From the wooden bindings, he screamed about how he would unleash his Naomas on them all and wreak havoc even more devastating than anything a mere kid can do. All Might brushed of the villain leader's raving, however. "No need for that. All your plans have already been foiled, not just by us, but other heroes in your Namu factory. No more games. It ends here, Shigaraki Tamura." More heroes streamed in to secure the villains, identifying them by name and ensuring that they didn't pull any tricks. All Might's words of reassurance, that everything was under control and nothing more could go wrong, brought comfort to Tokoyami. He staggered to his feet and began making his way towards the hero and student, all the while muttering what felt like useless apologies for his actions. "I never meant to. I didn't want to. You're hurt." All Might turned to acknowledge him, but the way his usual smile flickered for a moment into a grimace made it seem like all he saw was the monstrous quirk that had caused so much damage. Bakugu also appeared to be resentful of what he'd done, judging by the way he glared at him. Tokoyami had been warned by the symbol of peace not so long ago at the sports festival that it would be a problem if he were to continue relying so heavily on his quirk. All Might probably never foresaw something like this happening, though. But so long as nobody had to fight anymore, then they could put this whole ordeal behind them. Tokoyami could still be the kind of hero that didn't have to hurt anyone. Gran Torino stepped forward and brought attention to himself by confronting the constricted Shigaraki. "There's nowhere for you to run. I figured now would be a good time to ask. Where exactly is that boss of yours?" The villain was shaking in rage from where he stood wrapped tightly in wooden bindings. He was muttering incomprehensibly to himself. "Nonsense, this, not like this nonsense. Get out of my sight, vanish." All Might was starting to grow weary listening to the gibberish. He turned away from the students, still cradling his wounded side, and bellowed at the villain. "Answer me. Where is he right now, Shigaraki?" Shigaraki Tamura let out a hissing breath before screaming up at the hero, with all the audacity of a child, not getting his way in an unfair world. "I hate you." Without warning, the fabric of space was ripped apart by dark, blob-like explosions erupting from thin air and heralding the arrival of an all-new yet achingly familiar threat. Naumas flashed into existence, letting out their vaguely human cries of agony and anger, as though cursing their own disturbing reality. They ripped their way into the room, targeting anyone and everything in a spontaneous cavort of destruction. The heroes were thrown instantly into a panic, as the room filled with the monstrous beings. They're coming from nowhere. What's this black liquid? Who's creating these portals? I thought Kurogiri was stunned. It's not his doing, but they just keep coming. This dark liquid that had appeared in the midst of the Nomus was circling around them, as though it had a life of its own, its malicious intent evident with every movement it made. The heroes were disorganized, left unaware in a situation that had been flipped around on them, with no indication of what was going on. But there was a good guess of who was behind it and why it was happening. And yet all it took was All Might losing focus for a moment to survey the situation. A moment that left the students vulnerable. Black sludge pooled around Bakugo, drawn to him, and Tokoyami watched in horror as it seemed to devour the student, although it occurred to him that this wasn't the first time Bakugo had been attacked by sludge. "The hell is this? It smells," was all he could say in all the confusion before the liquid warped, and left behind no indication that he had ever been there, but for a puddle of darkness on the ground. All Might grabbed desperately at him, but he was already gone. Once again, he had disappeared beyond his grasp, and there was no greater failure than that. "Bakugo, my boy, Nuo." And then Tokoyami watched as it come for him. The darkness crowded in around him, and the futility he felt with nowhere to run and no hero watching over him left him too distressed to act against what could only be inevitable. He didn't want to be put through any of this anymore. He didn't like how there was always darkness coming for him, and nothing he could do against it. Tokoyami found himself backed against a wall that had yet to be destroyed. The sludge was starting to envelop him with such fervidness that his desperate attempts to claw it from him left no impact. "Get away from me," he roared, even knowing that the sludge taking him was not capable of obliging or even listening to him. But All Might heard. He pulled himself away from the frustration of losing Bakugo long enough to realize that he had left Tokoyami in the same situation, one that just maybe could have been avoided had he noticed mere seconds sooner. Whether or not that was the case, the hero reached out to him as the darkness wrapped around his face, obscuring his vision. He heard All Might call out to him desperately, but it was made evident a split moment later that his efforts had been for naught, and Tokoyami gritted his teeth in anger as he fell back into the hands of the villains. And yet this too must surely be his fault. If All Might had been faster, if he hadn't been injured. But that now felt like wishful thinking. The villains wanted him so badly. Or was this just the second act of him being involved with their true target, and he was just an unfortunate byproduct? Either way, the darkness was swirling around him. He could feel it, and a wave of nausea washed over him as he was yet again transported away from the outstretched arms of the people he feebly hoped were still willing to save him. Tokoyami held his breath as the black ooze took possession of him. But it wasn't long until the student was dumped unceremoniously onto a new playing field. He staggered around, gasping for air and horribly weary, but was still able to make some sense of his surroundings. Coughing mere feet away from him was Bakugo, cursing and spitting up the strange liquid. The two of them seemed to be standing in a battleground, where the familiar city terrain had been stripped away to reveal bedrock that was still steaming from the effects of some fresh, unknown disaster. But as they got their bearings, there was no denying who had been the source of it. Standing in the center of it all, looking right through them, was a dark figure clad in complicated machinery obscuring his face and a dapper suit. There was no doubt in their minds that the man radiated with ominous intention. "Bakugo," Tokoyami began hesitantly. Bakugo snarled a warning. "Get away. I don't care what you do. Just aim for the villains if being a hero still means something to you. But I'm not letting them take me again. So don't you dare try and interfere." Tokoyami gritted his teeth and trained his gaze to the smoking ground. Black liquid still dripped from him, and the cold of the night could be felt clearly through his tattered clothes. He realized that he no longer cared as much about escaping the grasp of the villains as his fellow victim did. If such a force like the League of Villains and this person, who he realized must be the master, truly wanted them, then what could possibly stop them? As if on cue, the rest of the villains appeared around them in a scattering of black, much like what had brought him here, only they appeared much less concerned. Grateful, in fact, for the power that had allowed them to escape from the heroes. The imposing man that had summoned them here stepped up to Shigaraki, walking within a mere hair's breadth of the young students. His voice was cold and calculating, and every movement he made was filled with such confidence and power that both of them knew that any move made against him, any word he deemed unfit, would mean an end to their short lives. And yet this master appraised Shigaraki with such integrity, like a father talking on equal terms with his son, that Tokoyami was caught off guard. Despite everything, these villains had a sense of community that he couldn't fathom. Tokoyami realized that he had been holding his breath again. He inhaled sharply, and the master turned his head ever so slightly. But what he said next came as a surprise. It looks like he came after all. A blast of wind warped the air, and the ground tremored with the impact that took place not a second after the first hint of this new arrival. All might was upon the villain in an instant. Fists of justice planted firmly in the villain's palms as they held on with equal strength. "I'll make you give everything back, all for one," All Might announced. "Is that to say you plan on killing me again?" All for One pressed, breaking their contact apart with a burst of power. "Because I think you're wasting your time here. Just look at the deplorable condition you're in. You must realize that you're much closer to death's door than even I am. Coming here was a mistake. None of that matters. I will take back my students and defeat you for good, if it's the last thing I do." Tokoyami heard the villain boss laugh, a sickly wet sound that hung in the air. As much hope as he wanted to have for the number one hero, All Might was still very obviously injured because of what Dark Shadow had done. That made All for One's next words all the more chilling. If that's the case, then it just as well should be. The wave of destruction that was triggered after that was the catalyst for ensuing battle. The villain boss and All Might were grappling in a fight of insurmountable scale. But All Might's chances for victory were questionable, as he was thrown through a mile of concrete buildings with a kind of force that would break any lesser human. Bakugu cried out for him, but Tokoyami couldn't say anything as rubble rained down upon them, and the blast from the attack blew everyone back. This whole situation was tipped in the villain's favor from the start. All for One looked down on them. "I was honestly hoping he'd take the hit better, but I suppose that's how things happen. No matter. I need you to leave, Tamira, and to take these kids with you." He used some strange ability on the comatose Kurogiri and turned away from them with a few parting words. "Now leave." All Might rose from the wreckage to meet the villain head-on once more, and the villains moved in on the two students. Although the fight taking place between the opposing powerhouses was of immeasurable strength, there was still the sensation that they were holding back. Not only was their presence making it impossible for them to go all out, as terrifying a thought as that might be, they were also in no position to escape. But far be it these disadvantages to dissuade Bakugu from engaging with the enemy. 6-on-1 was hardly a fair fight. But Bakugu made the most of it, with every explosion sent through the air. He roared in anger and sheer animalistic instinct as he fought them off. And Tokoyami still hadn't moved. He didn't have the same confidence and intent to do anything, and he hated it. But even if he could, even if he found himself able to muster the power within him to fight off these people and prove to some extent that he was useful and a candidate for heroism, there was no guarantee that it wouldn't just backfire in his face. He could just end up on the wrong side of Bakugu's flaming blasts, or worse yet hurting someone he didn't mean to again. There could be no worse feeling than that. Even still, he tensed, ready to throw himself into the fray without any further reasoning, if it meant that he could accomplish something. The hand guy, Shigaraki. He could tackle him maybe. Anything to keep his horrid quirk away from Bakugo. Maybe if he made enough of an effort, it would allow Bakugo to get away from this nightmare. If anyone deserved to get out of all this, it was him, so that he could go on to become an incredible hero. He had the drive and power to do so, Tokoyami knew. And the fact that these villains would confuse those qualities with that of a villain must have been insulting. And then there's me. Just as Tokoyami was preparing to rush forward, a familiar hand gripped his shoulder. It wasn't firm, very weak, actually, but it was enough to give him pause. Dabai was holding him back. But if he meant to convey any sort of threat, he was terribly unconvincing. He looked exhausted, and Tokoyami recalled that he had been out of commission not so long ago. "What do you think you're doing?" he rasped. "Get down." Dabai pushed him to the ground as clumps of concrete rained down from all sides. He grunted in pain as a stray rock struck his arm. Tokoyami squirmed away from him, but didn't retreat. Now was not the best time to be held back from the fray like this. But at the same time he was faced with such uncertainty regarding everything that he didn't want to make a wrong move. "Just hear me out, Tokoyami, please. Don't do anything reckless here, and I promise everything will work out for you. We can help you master your quirk, and you could be so much more in this world than what you are now. All you have to do is stay where you are. Otherwise you're just going to get hurt, and no hero will want to save you after the damage you've wreaked. But we'll be there when nobody else is, because that's just what happens to people with strong quirks that have been disregarded by the wrongdoings of society." The hard look in his icy blue eyes conveyed some kind of knowledge that Tokoyami didn't know, and he spoke with such conviction that he couldn't help but listen to his words, if even for a delusional moment. Amongst all the chaos, the temperature of the air dropped noticeably by several degrees and without warning. No one could ignore the large structure of ice that appeared from the sidelines, the source of which could only be guessed, but that he knew must belong to a fellow student of Class 1A. And then came the cavalry, bursting through the night sky like a shooting star made up of horribly impulsive teenagers. Tokoyami was both awestruck and bewildered, but he knew what this meant for him and Bakugo. They were being saved. Tokoyami began running forward, right to where Bakugo was staring up at the group above. He was getting ready to blast off towards them and be reunited with the friends that had come to save him. "I can't use Dark Shadow to reach them, but if I could just get to Bakugo, then he can." Dabai lurched desperately towards him, grabbing his leg and causing him to stumble back onto the ground. Tokoyami rounded on him, seething with rage at being brought down yet again by this person that he had to remind himself was a despicable villain. "Get off," Tokoyami growled, wisps of darkness emanating from his clothes like smoke as he struggled with the surge of anger washing over him. But that faltering moment had proven to be more than enough to accomplish their goal. Tokoyami looked back to where Bakugo had been standing. And now he was gone, climbing into the air being propelled by his own explosions. Only he wasn't on his own, because in all the confusion Tokoyami saw a carbon copy of himself holding on to the fleeing student. "Wait, what? No. No, where did the girl go?" Sure enough, as he saw them get ever nearer to each other, heard Kirishima cry out for them to come and reached his hand out to them. Tokoyami could feel his heart sink with the realization of what was happening. The two groups collided and were on their way to freedom, seemingly out of reach of all the villains. Except for one. "Bakugo, watch out!" Tokoyami screamed up at them, in the hopes that his voice might reach them. He couldn't make out what happened exactly, but a glint of silver and a loss of momentum was all he needed to know that Toga must have done something. Another blast, and Tokoyami watched as his own body fell from the air, flightless. Of course it wasn't him, but seeing his mirror image melt away to reveal the form of the sadistic girl that had stolen his blood still left him unnerved. The group of students were almost out of sight by now, regardless of what had transpired. But the villains weren't willing to let up quite yet. In a spur of the moment, Magni stepped in quickly. activating her magnetism quirk to send Mr. Compress flying towards them. Just as quickly, their desperate attempt to reclaim the student was dashed when Mount Lady, who'd been lying out of sight, gigantified to block the villains from reaching them. The villains falling from the sky were caught by the dark, circling portal of Kurogiri's quirk appearing beneath them, even as Mount Lady fell to the ground with a slam. They were gone now. His classmates were safe. The villains were left in a state of panic, and Shigaraki was roaring with outrage at his loss. Tokoyami wondered if they would even notice if he were to make a break for it now, if they would even consider giving pursuit if he were to run after them. But it couldn't be such an easy thing, despite the villain league being steadily driven further into a corner. All for One chose that moment to break from his fight, pull off yet another move using his abilities. Forcefully activating Magnus' quirk, he drew everyone inside Kurogiri's portal, ensuring their escape. Tokoyami felt the draw of it pulling him in, and he struggled in vain as this darkness beckoned him increasingly closer. "Don't do this to me again." Strangely enough, Shigaraki showed the same amount of reluctance. "Wait, no, master. In this condition, He began to sink into the portal. "I still haven't." All for One came to stand in front of the portal, even as it was already starting to vanish. "Tamira, continue the fight. Not all is lost. You still have everything in your favor. That much I can promise." Shigaraki vanished completely into the portal, just as it was starting to take in Tokoyami and Dabai, who had been farthest from where it had opened. It couldn't be avoided anymore. Not that he stood a fighting chance in the first place. Tokoyami looked up into the dark mask that concealed the master's face. He might have seen a glimpse of vaguely human features behind the veil, but a trick of the moonlight revealed something warped and unsightly. The head villain stared back down at him, addressing him directly. "You will become vital to his success. I don't think you'll disappoint me." Tokoyami didn't know how to respond to that, bewildered by these sudden words. But he found himself able to glare back evenly at the villain as the portal took him, and only then did the words come to him. "I won't be anyone's pawn." All for One laughed, only this time it sounded genuine. "That's good." All Might came rushing from behind him. Whether to continue the fight or to reach out to Tokoyami yet again, he couldn't be sure. But it hardly mattered. The student wouldn't be fooled by false hopes a third time. It was inevitable at this point, and he accepted that. His only hope now was that wherever they went from here, it would finally be morning. Whatever happened beyond his sight between these two symbols of their respective sides, it was past his control. Not that he ever had any to begin with. Tokoyami opened his eyes to a new place, one that was cold and bare. Him and the villains had been dropped off in some deserted location, probably far from the fight, but not too distant from city life. Fractured windows lining the walls showed the lights of buildings a short distance away, and a tinge of pink just starting to make its way into the dawn sky. Whatever this place was, they were the only ones here. Which was probably a good thing, because no one was happy after this major upset. Tokoyami inched closer to the wall as something crashed near his feet. Shigaraki was in a fit of rage and frustration, picking up whatever was within reach for him to either disintegrate or throw in an indiscriminate direction. After suffering such a huge blow, this man had nothing left than to throw a tantrum. "Why? Why did it turn out this way?" he screeched, shattering a glass bottle against the far wall. None of the others had any intent on approaching him in this state. But looking around in the dimly lit room, they had their own concerns. Mr. Compress was gently trying to shake Kurogiri awake. If anyone could offer guidance during these times, it was the one that had inadvertently brought them here. Magni had already disappeared somewhere, maybe to search the area. Toga was huddled over in the shadows, and it didn't look like she had any clothes. Whether as a consequence of her quirk or part of something else, he couldn't be sure. Spinner was dragging garbage and broken furniture into a pile in the corner and away from Shigaraki's reach. likely with the expectation that they might be here for a while. As for Twice and Dabai, they were lying on the ground not far from him, exhausted. Dabai propped himself up with his arm, shifting to look around. Shit, man, you need to calm down. What's done is done. Shigaraki rounded on him dangerously. I don't want to hear that from anyone, especially not you. If something were to happen to Master because of my mistakes then he'll get out of it, Mr. Compressed interrupted. Please show more faith in him than to so quickly dismiss all his efforts. He's the strongest, most influential man alive, and I dare say he has you to show for it. He turned back to Kurogiri solemnly, who was beginning to stir. Shigaraki groaned loudly in distress, but seeing the shape everyone was in must have done something to ease his boiling emotions. For everything he was still something of a leader. He stumbled over to one of the windows and looked out over the cityscape with a hidden expression, where he stayed silently mulling over things to himself. Magni came back with a stack of ratty blankets under her arm. We're in an abandoned care facility, if anyone was wondering. There's beds and some old supplies, but nothing substantial. She handed a blanket to Toga and draped another one over the comatose Twice with a sigh. Then she came up to Tokoyami and offered one. You doing all right, kid? She asked in a kind, husky voice. He didn't have a response to that, but accepted the blanket. It smelled musty and had numerous holes eaten into it. One of those paper-thin sheets you'd expect to find in a hospital. But he bundled it into his lap anyway. She casually tossed one over Shigaraki, who didn't even react, and proceeded to distribute them to everyone else, who took them in similar silence. Time passed slowly in quiet tension. After everything they'd witnessed, it was difficult to know which direction to go from here. Tokoyami was also at a loss. He stayed put. Even when these villains are at their lowest, he knew better than to do anything out of place. They fought hard for him, after all. Or rather, they fought hard for Bakugo. But not everything can work out the way you want it, huh? He thought bitterly to himself. Nobody was exactly happy with any of this. A clattering on the other side of the room drew his attention. Spinner was walking around somewhat aimlessly, his phone raised up to the sky as though as an offering of appeasement to some unseen force. He mumbled something, then stopped, cleared his throat, and spoke up. Hey guys, I got a signal, and, well, there's a live stream of the fight. It's still going, but... Shigaraki was upon the lizard man in an instant, throwing the blanket from his back and crossing the room to appear next to him without hesitation. Tokoyami jerked forward in anticipation, desperate to know what was happening. A tug on the hood of his coat made him turn swiftly, tensing in the off chance that he would be challenged, although he knew he wouldn't do much if someone were to ruffle his feathers. Cool your jets, Dabai grumbled, eyes steadied down towards his phone, which had miraculously stayed with him throughout all the chaos. Tokoyami would have thought that having been thrown around so much, it would have fallen from his loose pockets. I'm pulling it up now, but don't expect to like what you see. I think it's almost over. Tokoyami leered over his shoulder in nervous anticipation. Before long, a few of the other villains had gathered around them to watch the progress, including Spinner, who had given up his phone rights to Shigaraki. It was hard to make everything out through the smoky haze of destruction being filmed, and the large crack that fractured the small screen didn't make things easier. But sure enough, once the footage cleared up, they were standing there, all might and all for one. Tokoyami brought his hand to his beak, shocked at what was standing within the destruction of the city. There was the master, only he was no longer the cool, composed figure that had sent him here. His arm was a hideous amalgamation of intertwining parts, abilities, and muscles, making him an entirely different being altogether. His trim suit was a mess of torn fabric, and yet still he held himself with such composure, as though he weren't fighting against the strongest hero. Although it was pretty clear that the odds were stacked in his favor. One look at what was supposed to be the symbol of peace, and anyone could see that something was very wrong. All Might looked haggard, with ugly scars wrapping around a body that was not what he remembered. This All Might was lanky, his muscle mass almost deteriorating with every passing moment of continued strain. His golden hair hung limp and disheveled, framing a tired, angled face. He was coughing up blood, barely holding himself together, and through it all it was obvious that he was still clutching his injured side. But all around him, heard clearly through the sound of falling buildings and shifting wreckage, were the cries of the people rallying for his success. Tokoyami could hear it yelling silently in his mind, this desire to see All Might win. Please, you have to keep fighting. The two unstoppable forces flew at each other, fists blazing with energy that could be felt even through the little rectangular screen. The ground crumbled as they struggled against each other, driven to the brink by their own goals of heroism and villainy. An explosion of mass proportions surrounded them, and he could swear that it could be heard in the distance, even from here. Time slowed as they were pushed to their limits with what could only be their final blows. And then a sound rang out, clear as day, screaming right into the sky. United States of Smy and Ash. All Might could be seen summoning every last remnant of strength residing within him, every last ounce of power, and focusing it all into a fist that went through the entirety of All for One's defenses in order to plant itself firmly into his already disfigured face. The sheer knockback sent the villain reeling into the ground with such force that it made Tokoyami's own body physically hurt. But it was done. Finally, a victory worth celebrating. There was no sign that he would get up after that attack. Tokoyami jerked with excitement, fist raised slightly in discreet celebration. What? No, Niwu, Shigaraki wailed upon witnessing his master's defeat. He cursed loudly and threw the phone against the ground, making Spinner wince. But Shigaraki picked it back up just as quickly, intent to see it out till the end. Everyone turned back to Dabai's screen. All Might could be seen standing meekly over the still body of All for One. Even with the image quality being poor as a result of the cameras staying a fair distance away, he could see his chest gasping for air. With trembling arms, he raised his fist above his head in a sign of absolute victory. Cheers could be heard all around, and reinforcements moved in to secure the defeated villain. All Might's fist stayed clenched in the air as the cameraman found it was safe to approach. Then it dropped slowly, and everyone saw that the symbol of peace was pointing directly at the camera at him, with hard-set determined eyes. You're next. Tokoyami felt a chill run through him at the ominousness of those simple words. He had only a moment to think what they meant before All Might crumpled to the ground in a mess of fragile pieces. He laid there unmoving as people swarmed around him, calling for medics and telling everyone to back away. The camera went dark, and the video went to a reporter standing within the crowds of people yelling in cheer for his victory and fear for his fate. For Tokoyami, he felt his breath catch in his throat upon witnessing the scene that had unraveled before him. It didn't look like they were going to get any more information on either one's condition. So Dabai turned off his phone and looked around. You all are still here? I think that's enough excitement for one day. He got up and brushed himself off, although he had to be careful because his clothes were a mess of burns and rips. Hey, Magni, did you find any beds around here? Huh? Oh, yeah, there's some rooms down the hall. But, what do we do with Shigaraki? Kurogiri, who had finally come back fully to his senses, came up to them. We'd best leave him be for the moment to sort himself out on his own time. Until then, we could all afford to rest before the pace picks up again. It's been a long night. And everyone, please do continue to show courtesy to our guest. We don't exactly have much else going for us. He looked around the room, the purple flame like wisps of his body moving sluggishly. With a dejected sigh, he walked over to where Shigaraki was still staring intently at the phone, waiting impatiently for updates. Never mind that, Spinner muttered. What about the kid? How about you can keep an eye on him, Dabai said. Now where were those beds at? Priorities here. Spinner looked offended at the idea that he'd have to watch over Tokoyami. But every time he tried to object, Dabai would shut him down. They all collectively left the room with Shigaraki and Kurogiri behind to find their own place to be. Magni had to hoist twice over her shoulder, and everyone else trudged along with weariness in every step. Sure enough, there were rooms further down the hallway, each with 4 beds and heaps of thrashed items. Mr. Compress chauffeured them along, picking out a room that wasn't too bad looking and inviting Tokoyami, Spinner, and Dabai inside. The others picked out a separate room nearby. Tokoyami gazed around the room with little interest. He wasn't as keen on acknowledging his surroundings as before. All he really cared about at this point was curling up where he wouldn't be bothered. The beds didn't look too inviting, flimsy steel frame laden with rusted springs on the bottom barely supporting an old mattress, but it was enough for him. He laid his blanket down on one near the window, where daylight was just starting to stream in, and plopped himself on it without waiting. Dabai and Mr. Compress made themselves as comfortable as possible in these conditions, although he could hear Mr. Compress grumbling about how bad these beds are for the bones of an old man like him. And yet it wasn't long until they had fallen asleep. Spinner had sat down on the last bed nearest his, arms crossed over his polka dot shirt. His head kept dipping down before jerking back up with a start, fighting off the hardest battle of all that was sleep deprivation. After some time, he started whispering in a not very discreet manner. "Paste, kid. Tokoyami. You're still awake, right? So, hypothetically, if everyone here was asleep, but you wouldn't do anything that would get me in trouble, right? Of course, I was given the responsibility of looking after you. And I intend to do that on my word. But you can't always know." Tokoyami closed his eyes, promptly ignoring him. But when he did that, images of all the night's events came rushing back to him. Even with how exhausted he was, it was difficult to find any sort of comfort in sleep. Instead, he stared out to where the sunlight of a new day was glistening and focused on that. "Are you finding it hard to sleep? Just don't worry about anything." "Yeah," Spinner said, refusing to be quiet. "Is that light keeping you up? I can probably—" "No, leave it alone," Tokoyami said sharply. Spinner grumbled something to himself, but stopped talking after that. He could hear his breaths getting slower as sleep began to win the villain over. But still Tokoyami didn't move from his spot, not even to readjust himself or turn away from the rising sun. He resigned himself to this place, and these villainous people, without knowing what the future would hold. He found that he was burdened by guilt that followed him even in his subconscious. But despite that, he continued to look through the window, as the buildings of the distant yet tantalizingly close city became awash with sunlight, dispelling all the shadows of the night. Tokoyami had hoped that he would be too tired to dream, but still he recognized in the frayed edges of sleep that the claws of night terrors would clutch at him throughout this time. Nothing that he could fully comprehend, although it was easy to think that maybe it was his quirk harassing him in his sleep. And yet, when he finally did awake, they dissipated just as quickly, leaving him with a sense of ominousness, the source of which he couldn't quite pinpoint. There were many things to dread in the days to come, though, so he didn't linger long on the troubles of his sleep. He had other problems, as eventually he'd have to face his first day with the villains. It still left him shell-shocked to think of just how much happened over the span of a single night. It seemed as though he'd lost everything, but because that thought did nothing to help him, he ignored the forlorn feeling welling up inside him. Instead, he focused back on the scenery outside the dirty window of a bright sunny day that showed no sign that anything was ever wrong. The sun had already traveled far across the sky, indicating that he'd been asleep for a long time. He wondered how long he'd be able to stay like this before someone came and bothered him. On second thought, probably not very long. He was starting to get uncomfortable. He shifted ever so slightly to look at the rest of the room. It was empty except for the lizard man, who was peacefully asleep on the bed next to his and snoring faintly. Tokoyami sat up slowly on his own bed, muscles protesting with every movement after the events of last night and a fitful sleep. When he mustered himself to stand up, he staggered and clutched the windowsill. He could see his reflection in the grimy glass, disheveled and haggard. His red eyes looked even redder than normal, and with a sigh he ran a hand through his feathers. Whatever happens today, everything will work out. I'm not going to be here for very long, and that means that you're going to have to work for me. Dark shadow. No response from his last comment, but he figured as much. He wasn't about to get his hopes up so soon. Tokoyami gathered his bearings and made his way to the room entrance. Peeking his beak into the hallway, he saw nobody else. The villains probably should have left someone else here to keep an eye out. Since they didn't, he figured that must mean they trusted Spinner enough not to fall asleep on the job, or more likely they trusted him not to be foolish enough to sneak off in an area where they had much more control. Damn them. Tokoyami walked back to where Spinner was sleeping, blissfully unaware of anything around him. He shook his scaly arm gently, and the villain shot bolt upright, mostly awake in an instant and reaching instinctively to his utility belt for a knife that wasn't there. He stopped grasping for non-existent weapons when he realized who it was. Ah, kid, I thought you'd never wake up. He narrowed his eyes in suspicion. But, what do you want? There's a restroom in this building, right? He mumbled. Spinner took a few seconds to think about that. He seemed a bit slow, but in all fairness, he was just abruptly awoken. Yeah, yes, of course. I will, escort you there. Tokoyami followed him into the hallway, watching as he carefully adjusted the sword straps across his back. It didn't take long to find the restroom, and he was relieved when he could enter while Spinner waited patiently outside. Tokoyami opened the door back up after a short while, startling Spinner, and looked down the hallway to where voices that were becoming increasingly familiar could be heard. Are the others down there? If it were someone else, we'd be in trouble, so I'm going to say yes. Spinner began making his way towards where the rest of the league were conversing in another room. Oh, and if anyone asks, I was doing my job and was awake the moment you were. I think Stain would agree that being able to properly fulfill any mission given to you is essential to creating a true hero society. Tokoyami had to do a double take. Pardon? Are you referring to the hero killer Stain? Spinner turned to him excitedly, suddenly a lot more enthused. Who else? He accomplished so much good in his time active. But this world is already starting to regress back to its old ways of supposed heroes manipulating the way this world works. Stain needs people like you and me to carry on his will. It may look bad being called the League of Villains, but that's just a name to scare away false heroes and strengthen the resolve of true ones. Yes, see? Tokoyami didn't. If anything, the foundation that the self-proclaimed vigilante had built all his ideals on seemed like one constructed of misguidance and falsehoods. If this was the only justification he had to carry out all the actions he and the League have done, then he was clearly in the wrong frame of mind. But he wasn't about to say that. If this strange character had enough sense, then hopefully he'd be able to figure out that he was being used by Shigaraki within due time. But for now, this wasn't the time or place to start an argument. They ended up back in the room they had first been dumped in not hours before. Sure enough, they were deep in discussion. Shigaraki was nowhere to be seen, and in his stead was Kurogiri giving out orders. When they came in, the mist-cloaked man turned to greet them, although it was clear from the tone of his voice that he was still very tired. And Tokoyami wondered if he had been able to get any sleep at all beyond being in a comatose state. Oh, you two are awake. All right, just give me a moment. Kurogiri massaged the area where his temples might be inside. Toga, are you sure you'll be all right? I can transport you to the city limits, but if anything happens to you, we'll all be in trouble. The little vampire girl smiled cheekily. She was wearing something resembling clothes now. It was an outfit of blue, threadbare pants and an oversized matching shirt. Standard hospital attire that was left in this building. She shared a remarking resemblance to an insane asylum escapee. And for all he knew, he might not be too far off the mark. Yeah, old man, I've done this before. You couldn't keep me in this building if you wanted. So you may as well hand over some cash and let me run those errands for you. No need to worry though. I'll lay low. Nobody will even know it's me, Tilda. That's why I have to have you do it in the first place, Kurogiri muttered wearily, handing her a stack of money. All I ask is that you please be responsible and come back safely to the same place I drop you off. You have 4 hours, and I would certainly hope that would be enough time. Toga plucked the bills from his hand, humming in approval. I think this will be just fine. She pocketed the money and turned to acknowledge Spinner. Oh, Scaly, did you need anything? Wait, let me think. I'm going to need a new phone charger, I guess, Spinner said, ignoring the nickname given to him. That's strange. Wouldn't you need to have a phone for that? What? No, don't tell me. Kurogiri interjected. Toga, don't be cruel. Spinner, thank you for allowing Shigaraki to use your phone. It's a little worse for wear, and it ran out of power, but at least it's not broken. He handed the phone to a visibly relieved Spinner. Now that that's out of the way, we can proceed. Everyone stood back as Kurogiri made a portal. Tokoyami found that Toga was standing awfully close to him. He shifted away cautiously, and she took notice. Oh, and did you want something from me? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Tokoyami took a few steps away from the rest of the villains and Toga followed, facing him head on. Last night, I have to know. What did you do? Her eyes gleamed. Oh, you saw, didn't ya? Pretty cool, right? I was able to turn into you, if only for a moment. I don't care about that, Tokoyami hissed through his beak. I mean what you did, up in the air, when you took my escape away from me. What did you do to my friends? Those were your friends, She asked like she didn't quite believe it, and her smile twisted into a dissatisfied grimace. Well, I was trying to plant my knife into sweet little Izuku. Between you and me, I know he wants it. But then that bastard had to get between us, the same one holding on to Bakugo. I would have been just as happy to cut him up, too, for trying to take our new villain member away from us. What? Who was it? She looked at him quizzically. How am I supposed to know who that rando was? All that matters was that when I tried to cut up that red head, I couldn't even pierce his skin. Erg. It was so damn annoying. I was so close too. Kirishima, huh? So she wasn't able to do any actual damage. That's a relief. She sighed wistfully. But I'll get them someday, sure if I won't. That's what's so great about being in the league, even if it's a bit bleak now. But anyway, I must be off. Wish me luck, Tilda. You'll get what you deserve for your crimes someday. I could say the same to you, you know, she laughed, flicking open a pocket knife as she stepped through the portal to be on her merry way. Tokoyami scowled as she vanished. She doesn't actually think I'm as bad as her, does she? I'm supposed to be a hero in training. Tokoyami thought he'd said that to himself. But Kurogiri addressed him as he closed the portal behind her. Not quite. She holds some truth, and I'm sure you know more than anyone that you did your fair share of damage last night as well. That was an accident, Tokoyami rasped, averting his eyes. Even so, the nature of your actions are already very well known. Speculation has started to arise that if not for what Dark Shadow had done, All might have survived the fight against All for One. He was careful not to place the blame entirely on Tokoyami, but even still he knew that it was his own fault for the unforgivable wound he had given to All Might. Tokoyami balled his fists, filled with guilt and resentment. So All Might really is. Kurogiri nodded solemnly. It is unfortunate for the hero world, yes. Similarly, All for One has been placed in high-security prison. Neither side is particularly happy with this outcome. We've suffered some major blows over the course of a single night. But let's not dwell on that now. What's more important is that we prepare and build ourselves up. And that starts with training you. Tokoyami raised his head sharply, taken aback. What's this all of a sudden? I never agreed to that. Look, kid, Dabai growled, stepping forward with his hands in his pockets. It's pretty clear you're not going back to school anytime soon. You're as good as a villain now, so you may as well embrace it and learn to control that quirk while you're at it. Otherwise, you'll just keep being a problem for anyone involved. You're not sugarcoating this, are you? Tokoyami mumbled dejectedly. I wouldn't have anything to gain from that. Kurogiri clapped his hands together. I'm glad we've reached an understanding. Dabai, I leave you in charge of his training for today. See that he can get his quirk to work for him. And if anything gets out of control, well, I'll trust that you'll be able to handle it. Tokoyami was made to follow Dabai out back into a small field. They were surrounded on three sides by dense woodlands that reminded him of the training camp he had been at just yesterday. With the damaged facade of the abandoned care facility, they currently inhabited blocking out the view of the city from the other side. Kurogiri, Spinner, and Magni watched from the sidelines. They had an audience. Tokoyami stood nervously in the unkempt grass, facing off against a very unamused Dabai. The crow-headed student plucked at the sleeves of his hoodie, which at this point were horribly singed and dirtied. Okay, Dabai called out from his side of the field. Bring out your quirk. I know you can do it. The way he said it didn't sound like it was meant to be encouraging. Only that, if pushed, dark shadow was sure to appear. Tokoyami looked down, muttering, I'm not sure if... What was that? You better not be trying to back out of this. It doesn't matter if I'm only doing this because Kurogiri put me up to it, we're still doing it. Can't we? Tokoyami hesitated before speaking up louder. Can't we save this for tomorrow? This is hardly the best time to be. Dabai cut him off once more. Don't get me wrong here. I'm not trying to look out for your best interests. So don't try to chicken out of this. He smirked at his own words, and Tokoyami felt an ember of resentment burning up inside him. Tokoyami focused inside himself and prodded at the festering yet dormant consciousness of dark shadow. It twitched and writhed like a decapitated snake, responding begrudgingly to his summons. While before it would have appeared instantly to his beck and call, this time the sentient quirk materialized slowly into existence. It loomed over him, larger than usual for the amount of light there was, but still expectantly docile. Its outline spluttered, and the dark threads comprising it crawled in different directions, as though the fabric of its form was ready to dissipate whenever it became convenient. It swayed in the air, growling faintly with every movement, and Tokoyami couldn't help but feel concerned that this unstable thing was so close to him that it was a part of him. It had troubled him in the past, of course, but theirs was supposed to be a compliant relationship, and so he'd never had any reason to worry. But looking upon his quirk now filled him with unease. Given the opportunity, he would rather wait to summon the creature and hope that it would mellow out in its own time. But that was not the case today. Tokoyami raised his hand vaguely towards the villain waiting impatiently for a response and began to utter a command. But before the words could even leave his beak, dark shadow was streaking across the field, clearing the distance between it and Dabai with breakneck speed. Usually the quirk was much more tactful, even without direction, but here it spread its claws wide and dived straight towards the opponent without any thought. Dabai leapt to the side, narrowly avoiding the teeming mass of shadows, and swiftly delivered a blast of dark fire to its side. It shrieked in furious dismay, causing Tokoyami to flinch, and his lack of focus caused it to vanish within him. Groans could be heard from the small captive audience. They have nothing better to do. Hey, what gives? Dabai said in obvious annoyance. You were doing just fine, right? Bring it back. Tell it I'm not done fighting or something. We don't feel like fighting. That wasn't entirely true. Dark Shadow was more than eager to be free and doing something beyond its constraints, and Tokoyami knew this. but I'll be damned if I let it get the best of me again. So start listening to me." Dark Shadow uttered an animalistic growl that reached beyond his mindscape for everyone to hear. Then it went back to whispering its toxicity quietly to him. "Not until you give me a good reason to." Dabai scowled, having no knowledge of the transaction between the two. "You don't feel like it? Well, that's too bad." The villain rushed at Tokoyami with the same ferocity that Dark Shadow had shown him. He came all too close before exploring the air with his flames, stretching his hands towards the startled kid. A wicked smile twisted the burned flesh of his face as he came within inches. Tokoyami felt a moment of panic as he felt the heat wash over him and willed for Dark Shadow to protect him. The quirk did materialize, but only to arch over Dabai and away from the attack, leaving him exposed to the blast. Tokoyami stumbled backwards, almost falling, and crossed his arms protectively over his head. But the fire blast never came. Dabai ceased his flames in an instant, and instead shoved Tokoyami in the chest, so that he tumbled over completely. Dark Shadow was coming around from behind to attack him with frenzied claws, but Dabai dropped down to the ground, allowing the quirk to pass over him harmlessly. "Hey, you be careful now," he said, addressing the quirk. It circled back around and came to a stop behind Tokoyami, as though his controller was meant to be the shield, and glared at the villain. "Don't look at me like that. It's not my fault you have such bad reflexes. I don't think you're doing what he wants, huh?" Dark Shadow swayed in the wind as Tokoyami pushed himself off the ground and into a sitting position. He looked behind him to where the quirk was glowering, and was surprised to hear it talk aloud to him. "He's trying to get me hurt." The bird-shaped shadow hissed. "My decisions are better." Tokoyami hung his head. He knew full well that Dark Shadow didn't always respond well to being put in positions where he was at a disadvantage. "It's not like you give me much of a choice, though. I give you every chance." The quirk hissed angrily into his thoughts. Even though Dabai hadn't heard their internal conflicts, he seemed to grasp the situation quite well. "So this is some sort of conflict of interests," he sighed wearily. "I don't think I've ever encountered a quirk so annoying. Having a sentient power always at your side is fun in concept, but then it's not nearly so easy just learning to use it. This whole thing feels like a compromise." "And no, don't misunderstand," Tokoyami said. "I'm the one in charge here." "Like hell you are," it spat. "Okay, yeah, that's great," Dabai said, rising to a stand. "Now get up. I'm not going to attack you." Tokoyami picked himself back up. Dark Shadow hovered near him, giving off an aura of dissatisfaction. He looked over at his quirk, not quite sure how to approach it. "Hey, look at me," Dabai demanded, snapping his fingers for attention and producing the smallest of sparks. "I'm trying to figure something out, though I doubt I'm the best person for this." From the other side of the field came a call from Magni. "So is the fighting over or what?" "Either sit tight or go away," Dabai yelled back. "I didn't even invite you here," he turned back to the student. "Okay, I gotta know. What's your preferred fighting style? I haven't seen enough of it, and it's hard for me to see what you usually do because of your quirk acting up. So what's the first thing you do at the start of a battle?" "Yeah, what do you do?" Tokoyami didn't appreciate how he had to explain so much to this dangerous man, but of course he was compelled to supply an answer. "I send out my quirk, obviously." "That's great, but what do you do?" It sounded like he was starting to get impatient, but he didn't understand why, and this was in turn making Tokoyami irritated. "I give the orders. It's my quirk." "Cool. Stop doing that." "What?" Dark Shadow snickered. "I like this person." Dabai sighed. "Hear me out. I can't say I know the best course of action, but it's pretty shitty that two beings that are literally connected have to struggle to coexist. Why should you have to worry about losing control? At the same time, it's not fair that Dark Shadow should have to worry about soaking up all the damage." He started to back away, creating space between them before speaking again. Attack me again. But this time I want you to do it, not your quirk. Keep that thing out, though, in case it feels like helping you. Tokoyami could tell that Dark Shadow was pleased with this turn of events. The quirk was still a disillusioned mass of bitterness with little hope for controlling. But this was still considerably better than the amount of spite it had lashed at him not too long ago. There was nothing that had felt quite as bad as when the influence of night had turned the being inside him into something malicious enough to whisper constant tales of self-doubt into his head. He had once enjoyed conversing with Dark Shadow, but year by year it had steadily chipped away at his insecurities. Or maybe I'm just confusing that with my own thoughts. I can't hardly tell the difference anymore. Tokoyami stood to face the fire user one-on-one. It made him think back to the time of the tournament, and how he had faced off against Bakugo. He recalled the words that All Might had said to him after his loss. You sure are strong. However, in order to fight well against different types, you must not rely only on your quirk. If you train your own strength more, then you'll have more options when you fight. He was right, of course. Training for him had always been for the betterment of Dark Shadow, using the best of what he'd been given. Over time, though, a shift in balance had started to occur, and even after understanding what needed to be improved, he wasn't able to reach any sort of goal for self-improvement before being thrust into a nightmarish series of events. All Might probably knew that I wasn't able to take him up on those words he said to me. I'm sure he'd be disappointed. In the end, it was my failure that helped to lead him to his demise. Dark Shadow didn't tease him for once, remaining silent while listening in to his thoughts. Dabai called him out of his brooding. Are you gonna come at me or what? Tokoyami jerked back to attention, taking a deep breath. He tensed his muscles and ran right towards the villain with no concept of caution, Dark Shadow being dragged behind him. He felt horribly small coming right up the fire user, his height just reaching his chest. But he'd hoped that he could use his small stature to his advantage. Unfortunately, Tokoyami either overestimated himself or underestimated Dabai, which in hindsight was a horrible idea. Tokoyami actually had very little idea of what he was supposed to do when he reached him, only that he shouldn't use his quirk. Dabai moved like he was about to shove him to the ground again, so he ducked under his arm and turned towards him, ready to throw his whole weight against him in a tackle that might topple the sinister foe. Only his opponent sidestepped him, and suddenly he had made himself get thrown off balance by trying to rush into an ill-advised course of action. Dabai delivered a swift kick to his back, grounding him once more. Dabai rested his foot carefully on his back in smug victory. A stark contrast to the first time he'd pinned him to the floor back, when he'd first arrived at the villain's hideout. So the bad news is that your hand-to-hand combat sucks. No wonder you left it all up to your quirk. But hey, at least you're trying, right? Tokoyami waited for Dabai to take his shoe off his back before standing back up to his feet and brushing off his tattered clothes. He could tell even without hearing it that Dark Shadow was laughing at his expense. Then again, maybe he deserved this. It's what All Might would have seen fit, right? The sun was beginning to fade from the sky, becoming blocked out by the building and trees. The air was steadily growing cooler, and yet Tokoyami's skin burned with heat. He was staring down at the ground again, hands clutching grass and chest heaving for breath. The shadows of dusk were starting to stretch across the field, but the darkest ones present hovered over him. Dabai stepped up to him, towering above his exhausted frame. You're not done yet, are you? You haven't even shown me anything good. Is this what that you teaches its students? That's just disappointing. Tokoyami tuned him out. This nuisance had been goading him on for hours. He didn't have the strength to keep this up for much longer. Even though this didn't seem like a dangerous situation where he could get hurt, it was still disheartening to be so beaten down in a place that offered no retreat. Not only that, but his energy was being continuously drained by having Dark Shadow remain in the physical realm. Even now, The sentient quirk was looking down at him with an unnerving amount of disinterest despite the fact that they were literally connected. Every time he slipped up and let the quirk disappear back into him, Dabai would stop and demand that he bring the thing back out. Not to fight. Oh no, that would have been useful. Instead, the shadowy figure just watched him like an audience member sitting back on the sidelines, laughing at his expense sometimes and criticizing his moves. Admittedly, though, the quirk had grown less aggressive over time, even when the light had started to fade. It must be growing bored with his constant failures. Tokoyami gathered himself enough to push himself into a sitting position and catch his breath. That's enough. Can we please stop for the day? Oh, giving up so soon? Dabai smirked. Tokoyami swiftly pushed himself up the rest of the way and clasped tightly onto the collar of the villain's white shirt. It was hard to pretend to be intimidating, but Tokoyami only hoped that he could get his point across. It hasn't even been a single damn day since you took everything away from me. I get what you and all those other criminals are trying to do with me. But just because I'm complying with you now doesn't mean that I'll let you push me around like this forever. Tokoyami had started trembling at some point, even while his voice had shown resolve and determination. Dabai stared down at his icy eyes, unsympathetic. He carefully removed the kid's hand from his shirt, and when all the fingers were detached from his clothing, Tokoyami snatched his hand back, cringing at what he'd done. Don't get snarky with me, bird. Don't think you can order me around, either. Yeah, I get it. It sucks that you were forced to fly the coop like this. Hell, I'll even take responsibility for this. I admit I dragged you into this mess twice, and I'll keep pulling this SH stick for as long as I have to, so long as Shigaraki is determined to keep you with us. But while you're here, you may as well enjoy the free training. Tokoyami simmered with resentment. At the very least, he was thankful that nobody else was around to hear this exchange. Their audience had long since grown weary of watching the one-sided sparring. Tokoyami would, however, notice that Kurogiri would check up on the two every now and again. Whether to ensure that he wasn't trying to pull any escapist tricks or confirm that Dabai wasn't being too hard on him, it wasn't certain, but both seemed like reasonable options. As much as Tokoyami didn't want to admit it, Dabai had done well to pull back his punches and keep his fire to a minimum. He'd still ended up with some new burns and bruises, while leaving hardly a mark on the more experienced fighter. But at this point his body felt so battered that he doubted it made much of a difference. I just want a break, Tokoyami murmured. Me too, kid. Dabai scratched the back of his head, tousling his greasy black hair with a sigh. Yeah, I think we're done here. You can, put your quirk back. I doubt it wants to be around like this much longer. Tokoyami willed Dark Shadow to vanish. It did so without any lagging, but he could tell the quirk was disappointed. And yet having the entity retreat back into him was like having a heavy burden be lifted off his shoulders for instant relief. On the contrary, I think he was having the most fun of us all, Tokoyami scoffed. I've only ever heard you refer to that thing as an it. Unless I'm missing something. His feathers prickled with embarrassment. That's hardly an important detail to notice. It doesn't matter. It is fine. Dabai raised his open hands defensively, but the simple gesture was enough to make the crow-headed student tense in preparation for another attack. He could do nothing but anticipate whatever move came at him next, and hope that he'd have what it takes to counter it. Of course, that wasn't supposed to ignite that response in him. It was supposed to come off as non-threatening. But Tokoyami has so wired from the day's events that he didn't care. And Dabai, seeing the kid's response, quickly put his hands back down with an aggravated huff. Whatever. I'll take your word for it. The villain turned and began walking back to the darkened building, making sure to keep his eyes on Tokoyami all the while just in case. Now come on. I'd hate to be your babysitter for much longer. Tokoyami resigned himself to following, too tired to offer up a biting response. He shuddered as he stepped over the threshold into the building and slowed to a stop. something that didn't go unnoticed. Oi, what's the matter? The day's not over yet. Why not? I just want to go back to my room. Dabai checked his phone for the time. Aren't you curious to know if Toga made it back? Why should I care what happens to that deviant? Tokoyami threw back at him with all the calmness he could muster. He didn't want to act so obviously spiteful, lest he get pestered further. But Dabai should know by now his distaste for the strange girl. But Dabai persisted. Well, we did send her out to get food and supplies, and she should be here by now. But if you really don't any food, then who am I to stop you? Tokoyami narrowed his eyes. In my position, it would be unwise to turn down that offer. Can't you bring me something? I don't exactly look forward to seeing any other faces tonight. Dabai laughed at him. You don't actually expect me to take you up on that? Nah, I'm done doing stuff for you today. The only thing you've done is beat me up. And besides, if that's what your views are, then I definitely can't let you hole up away from the others now. The villain came up behind him just to shove him lightly in the back in the direction of where the central room was. But it was enough to make him stumble on his weary feet. Despite this, and while grumbling with resentment, he found that they were making their way towards where the rest of the villains were no doubt lounging. They entered the room to find that everyone was waiting impatiently for their line to the outside world to arrive. Shigaraki was still strangely absent, but even the strange man twice was present this time around, looking to have, for the most part, recovered. When he caught sight of the two entering, he waved cheerily to them. Hi, hello, you two look great. Did you sleep well? That sounds like a joke, Tokoyami huffed. Hey now, he doesn't mean any harm. It's just a question you don't have to answer, Dabai chastised. Tokoyami sunk deeper into his tattered hoodie, wishing he wouldn't be given any more attention. It was one thing to be associated with this group of murderous thugs, and most of these people, if not all, had to have killed before, but to be involved in their interactions as well was stressful. A part of him still wanted to believe that he could get back on the path of being a hero, that Yua and the public would forgive him for getting caught up with these villains. Dabai went off to talk to Kurajiri, who was nervously looking at his watch, an open portal at his side. That was sure to be where Toga was went to come from upon her return. But Tokoyami wondered what would happen if he were to race into the purple window right now. Would he be restrained before he could make it? Or would he reach it just to find himself thrown a distorted place with no guarantee that he'd come out the other side? He didn't understand the misty bartender's quirk enough. He could just as well be easily tracked and followed. Or maybe he'd come out the other side only to confront the sadistic girl Toga. A hand was placed gently on his shoulder. But this time he didn't react as frantically as the last time this had happened. He already knew who this person was. Twice was looking at him with a worried expression. Oh, it's been a long day, so I figured you might want to sit down. You can relax here, you know? In all actuality, Tokoyami hadn't been awake much longer than 5 hours. But with how much of that was spent fighting and getting tossed around, it had definitely been an exhausting day. He took him up on his offer and collapsed into a rickety metal chair nearby. He stared down at the dark and grimy floor, avoiding eye contact with all the others, and supported his head in his hands. The not-so-discreet sound of another chair being dragged across the floor could be heard as Twice brought up a chair to sit a few feet away from Tokoyami. It looked like he was hoping to talk to the crow-headed kid. But Tokoyami ignored him and kept his focus elsewhere. For a villain, he was quite respectful compared to the rest and left him alone. But it was evident that he had something he wanted to say. The violet portal shimmered, causing everyone to look up. Kurajiri breathed out in relief. Finally, he could tell that everyone had been waiting anxiously. Sure enough, everyone is glad to see the return of Toga and all that she had brought. She skipped out of the portal, towing in her wake a collection of grocery and shopping bags. I'm back, Tilda, she sang, plopping the bags down with a pleased expression. The girl had changed outfits since they'd last seen her, having gotten herself a new school outfit and ribbons for her hair. She also had a frilly pink backpack slung over her shoulder that clinked with the sound of glass every time she moved. Foods in these bags, clothes and other stuff over here. Go crazy. I already have what I want. Kurogiri stepped up to her, exasperated. Toga, you're late. I see you've had quite a productive day, and that's good. But what on earth took you so long? My job wasn't as easy as you made it out to be, you know. I could have been caught, and then we'd all be in trouble. Kurogiri was staring her down evenly, waiting for her to continue. Okay, yeah, and I may have gone back to my place and hit up some spots and maybe weren't necessary. But I did everything else you wanted, so everything's all right, right? Did you at least bring me back any change? Nope. But that's your own fault. So sit back and enjoy all the goodies I brought you all. Most everyone was already sitting down with whatever they'd found in the grocery bags. Granola bars, cookies, chips. Spinner had located a greasy bag of cold fast food burgers, which seemed to him like the best thing ever. Magni unpacked some of the more essential items on a table, with stuff like blankets, clothes, toiletries, and portable phone chargers being set out for anyone to grab. Tokoyami grabbed a bottle of water first thing, despite how much his stomach demanded food. He tore open the cap and tilted his beak to the side so that he could drink from it. Twice was looking at him curiously. Sorry to interrupt, but do you need a straw or something? Tokoyami drank some more before stopping to address him. Usually, yes, but it's not important enough to warrant asking for. Twice handed him some energy bars, which he gladly accepted. Well, I can put in a request for that next time anyway. Anything else? Tokoyami thought for a moment. Some apples would be nice, he murmured just loud enough for him to hear. Twice nodded in understanding and went back to his own food. Before he could even think to relax in this environment, Toga strode up to him, instantly putting him back on edge. She tossed a dark plastic bag into his lap. A grin stretched across her face. Brought you something. This isn't some sort of sick prank, is it? Forgive me for being a bit hesitant to see what's in here. She laughed. Aw, I just thought I'd do something nice for you is all. Is that so hard to believe? Without even waiting to see if he'd look at the contents of the bag, she turned and went on her merry way. Despite looking so innocent, everything she did felt like it had some malicious intent behind it. He had no reason to trust her, and yet here she'd brought something for him. He peeked into the bag, his face a mask devoid of emotion. He reached his hand in and felt fabric. He pulled out partway what he had discovered to be a new black hoodie before shoving it back into the bag. For some reason, he hated the generosity being shown to him by these people that belonged in the darkness of the underworld crime scene. It wasn't right with him that they treat him like their own. Regardless, though, he found himself holding tightly onto the bag of clothes, as though afraid it'd be taken away, but thankful to have it.